Everyone, we're gonna kick off day 2. So welcome back for those of you who were here with us yesterday, and welcome to the Housing Institute for those of you who are just joining us for today. I'm Dana LeWinter. I'm the Chief of Public and Community Engagement at MHP, and it's just to set you up for a successful day. Yesterday, I asked for a show of hands of who took the train. Today, I'm going to ask for a show of hands who stayed up to watch the Celtics late last night. Okay, so we're all going to be finding our way to the coffee in the corner, but we're, all happy and glad that you still made it back even after staying up late. All right, so I did it yesterday, but I want to, again, make sure to thank the community assistance team. A lot of them are actually in the hallway helping make this all happen, but could they all raise their hands if they're in the room? Can we give a round of applause to these folks? Emma, folks are pointing at Emma. She made all of this happen, all the logistics. Laura, the director of the community assistance team, kind of pulls this all together. So not only are they experts in all of the work that they do, but they are experts in making this really exciting session happen. So thank you to them. So again, we are here on day 2. Your agenda has all of the materials and all of the sessions that happened yesterday. If you weren't here or you missed any of the sessions, we are recording all of them. So you'll be able to find those. Check your spam folder. There usually will be an email that goes out, but if it gets caught in your spam, you won't be able to find it. Or just go to our website. You'll be able to find all of the information there. Bathrooms, of course, outside in the hallway on either side. If you want to connect with our community assistance team after the Housing Institute, on the front table, there are QR codes with office hours for each of them. So they all have really great expertise in all of the things that you're learning about over the course of these 2 days. So please reach out to them to connect. Also on your tables are a social media guide, a QR code for the binder. When you go to the binder page, scroll down, you'll find all of the materials from all of the sessions. So don't feel like you need to be taking notes unless you want to. And then you will also see feedback forms. So if you didn't get a chance to do a feedback form for yesterday, please go ahead and do that. And at the end of today, please make sure to give us your feedback on the sessions. A reminder that anytime it says on your agenda, Wachusett Room C, that's actually the wedding tent, as folks have been lovingly calling it, and I think it's really lovely out there today, so find your way there. Please return your name tag at the end of the day, and parking is being validated at the front desk, so if you haven't done that already, please make your way to the front desk at some point today. All right, I think that's all of our logistics items. So now I just have the pleasure of handing it off to our Center for Housing Data team from MHP. They are going to be talking about how you can bolster your pro-housing message with data. So yesterday it came up over and over and over. What's the data on this? How do we learn more about this? How do we present it to our communities? Data is really powerful, and it's more powerful when you know how to use it in a way that is going to advance your message. So these guys are the experts. I'm really excited to welcome them. Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So we are very excited to be here with all of you to kick off day 2 of MHP's Housing Institute. For everyone who was able to join us yesterday as well, we heard from so many amazing presenters, and all of us were struck by how many common threads we heard throughout the day. So across sessions, so many people spoke not about units, but about families and neighbors and community. We heard the power of personal stories and narratives to making our case. There was talk about solidarity and paradigm shifts and bold visions driving policy and planning. And at the end of the day, before heading off for the site visit, we talked all about public engagement, how leaders can prepare for meetings, anticipate the questions they're likely to be asked, and choose when it's appropriate to respond to sometimes distracting comments and when to move on and reframe the conversation. So our CHD team is looking forward to building off those themes as we talk now about how we can use data to bolster our pro-housing message. So an introduction first. I'm Ellen Maria. I'm the research manager at the Center for Housing Data. I'm joined by my colleagues Tom Hopper, CHD's director, and Matija Jankovic, our senior research analyst. And the Center for Housing Data at MHP analyzes and shares information to drive housing conversations. We publish research, work closely with our colleagues in other areas of the organization to support their work, and develop easy-to-use data tools for the public, which we'll be talking more about today. So our work is really outwardly focused and public-facing, with the goal of producing research and data tools that help spark productive conversations about housing policy and ultimately lead to better housing outcomes across the Commonwealth. And we believe it's really important not just to have the data, but how we talk about that data as well. So this means our work is highly collaborative with our colleagues at MHP and in the community. Excuse me. And we have an especially close working partnership with our public affairs and community assistance teams to ensure that local knowledge is driving our research. In addition, we work to promote data literacy and democracy by creating accessible, interactive tools that empower people within the housing policy space and the community as a whole to access and use data to drive their housing conversations. So one of our most important audiences is all of you in this room. We're working to produce tools, analysis, and resources to help you do your jobs and communicate your work to your partners, communities, and constituents. So a little roadmap of this morning. We wanted to begin today by talking about the role that data can play in effective messaging before diving deeper into an overview and site demo of two of our data tools, DataTown and Residentity. Then we'll bring the messaging strategies and tools we've talked about together to go through a storytelling and reframing exercise with time for questions as well. So why did we want to use our time with you this morning to talk about data and messaging? As you're all well aware, municipal leaders like yourselves play a critical role in local housing efforts. The Commonwealth faces huge regional housing and other policy needs within a structure of strong local control, where community perceptions and political will can often be at odds with the collective solutions that we need. So all of you are working within this tricky dynamic of local needs and concerns, regional needs, and state policy efforts and expectations. So you're all often in a tough position of advocating for forward-thinking solutions that come up against a lot of community resistance. So to help wade through this dynamic, local leaders, including planners and board and committee members need support, resources, and access to quality data and information to help chart a course for meeting our goals for the future and to engage meaningfully with community members around that vision. So when we think about the resources available to us to support those conversations, data is one important tool, but it is not the right tool for every job, and we want to be thoughtful about how we can use data most effectively. So when we're out in our cities and towns, I'm sure many of us have heard statements from community members, maybe from local officials or board members out in our meetings that sound something like, I support affordable or multifamily housing, but our schools will be overburdened, we don't have the sewer or water infrastructure, development harms the environment, the traffic will be horrible, property values will go down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when we hear these statements, we have a choice to make. We can use data to myth bust these talking points and directly refute what someone is saying. But we should first ask ourselves if using this data to frame our message that way will actually convince somebody who already believes these statements. Will it lead to a distracting debate that sucks up time and energy? And is this even what you really want to be talking about? So remember, you have the opportunity to set the narrative here and bring the conversation back to why you're advocating and what your end goal is. So instead, you can use your time to reframe the narrative and focus on your messaging of I support affordable housing or I support multifamily housing because it could provide more affordable options for our community members who need it. Or our downtown needs more people in it to support businesses and cultivate a lively public realm. Denser walkable neighborhoods, especially connected to transit, reduce congestion and carbon emissions. Or I want our teachers, our food service workers, firefighters, municipal staff, and other members of our community to be able to afford homes here. Or I don't want to live in a homogeneous community. Diverse housing options will help us become a more diverse and complete community. So again, these examples are just some of the motivations that our team came up with, but we encourage you to reflect on your personal reasoning as well. Housing is inherently personal, and you can incorporate this into your reasoning. Maybe you have friends leaving the community because they could no longer afford it. Or you have a child who wants to move back to where they grew up to raise their own family, but they can't do so. Housing is about home, neighborhood, and community, not just unit counts, and that personal connection can help bring people together. So ultimately, your message can be especially powerful and cut through stagnant dialogue when you use data to support your own forward-thinking community vision rather than to counter others' talking points. So one way that we approach this is through the pivot, away from disruptive negative comments and toward positive constructive frames that help make the case for the housing outcomes that you're advocating for. Dr. Tiffany Manuel built this powerful framework as part of the case made and laid out some steps that we can follow. So first, you can keep track of disruptive comments that come up as you're making the case for your work. Second, you can find an element in those comments where you can find common ground as a way to diffuse some of the tension. This means relabeling part of the argument in a positive way through a bridging statement, but not repeating opposing viewpoints, which would just give them more airtime. With this bridging statement, you can then return to your positive message and vision backed by data and facts, keeping in mind that your audience is often others in the room listening to this dialogue and still deciding how they feel. So the pivot can help you keep control of the conversation and steer toward the topic at hand. Both purpose and preparation are key to guiding the conversation you want to have, which brings us back to the data tools that we've built to help you support your pro-housing message. So we'll be talking through two of those tools next, starting with Tom and DataTown.
Great. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Ellen. So keep this slide in mind, keep the prior slide in mind. We're going to take a slight shift in gears here to talk about our websites, but we will be returning to this concept and practicing it together a little bit. So start thinking about your own frames for housing, because we're going to revisit that in just a few minutes. So before I jump into a brief overview of our sites, DataTown, and Mattia will take us through Residencity, I'd love to see a show of hands of anybody who has used DataTown. You're warming my heart. This is great. Thank you. Hands down. How about Residencity? How many folks in here have used Residencity? Great. This is making me feel really good. And if you've been to the Housing Institute in the past, or if you've heard our team present somewhere else, you've probably heard about these tools. We talk about them all of the time because we love them. So today we're just going to give you a pretty broad overview, a basic introduction to the site so that we can save a little bit more time for the interactive exercise. So if you haven't been to DataTown or haven't been to Residencity, encourage you to do that. Please do that tonight and not right now on your phones. We're going to be doing a live demo of the sites, and we just want to make sure that they're running as smoothly as possible for that. All right, so let's talk DataTown. So we created DataTown because we had been hearing from people like you, planners, advocates, others working on housing issues at the municipal level, that there was a need for better access to information. And things as straightforward as how many homes does my town have, or how many renters in my town are cost burdened. That information was scattered across the internet. When you could find it, it could be difficult to access, could be time consuming to work with. Anyone who's been to the Census Bureau's data site knows the pain of that. And so we wanted to stop you from having that pain, so we took it on ourselves. We did the work for you. DataTown includes municipal level data from a variety of sources, such as the Census Bureau, but also state departments like the Division of Local Services, the Department of Education, and others. We've downloaded all of those data sets. We've tidied them up, cleaned them up, and standardized them, and we've made them available at the push of a button. So a push of a button for any one of the 351 cities and towns across the state. So even small communities that are under 1,000 still have all that full suite of information on the site. Not only can you grab the data you need, but we also create graphs on the fly that visualize the data, and you can download and use those visuals in any way you want, so a report or a presentation, anywhere where the information might be useful. Additionally, we have a module that allows you to compare the same pieces of information across multiple communities, so you can see how your town stacks up against neighboring communities or similar communities across the state. We also have coaching text and data source explainers and accurate information about where the data is coming from so that you have the information you need to understand the data yourself and hopefully even explain it to others. So I'm going to do a tricky maneuver and jump out of PowerPoint and into a browser to do a brief demo of Datatown. You'll notice Datatown does have a timeout, so we're just going to let this reload. Yes? Ooh. I did the thing where I touched the cord I wasn't supposed to. Thank you, Natia. I think Emma told me just to unplug and plug it back in, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Hopefully it'll work before she gets up here. I did it. Thank you, Emma, for good hustle, though. Thanks, Emma. Okay. Oh, am I too quiet? Thank you. All right. Thank you, Emma. Working hard. So when you open Datatown, you're greeted by a homepage that includes some information about recent updates and some background on why we created the site. I'm going to quickly show you the two exploration modes we have on the site. And the first is Explore One Community. And if you look at the left-hand bar here, you will see that we are set up for success. It's auto-checked. And then all you need to do is choose a community. And because we're here, I'm going to choose Worcester. And what you didn't see once I entered Worcester is all the data on the back end of the site just refreshed. And all the data is available for me to explore. So let's go to our little drop downs here. I'm going to expand them so you get a sense of what's available in the site. So we have information on demographics, so population size, information on income, tenure, and race. We have information on the housing stock, so your housing inventory, multifamily, single family, recent permitting activity. Information about jobs, employment, commuting patterns, and this other topics category that right now includes school enrollment and municipal finance. So let's explore a couple of these together. First is housing inventory. So this is where you'll see the composition of your housing stock by type, and you'll see on this chart that not only do we have information for Worcester, but we show that data next to the state so that you can make a comparison. Does my town have relatively more or less than the state? And you'll notice for Worcester, not surprisingly, less of Worcester's housing stock is single family and more of it is large multifamily, pretty typical of our urban centers. I will just show you how easy it is to choose another community. Cambridge, similar story, right? A lot of multifamily housing. I also want to draw your attention to these buttons down at the bottom. So this is your opportunity to take this information off of the site. You can grab this exact chart, click download chart as image, and that's going to create a browser download. You just saw it pop right up to the top of the browser there. Same for the raw data. You can grab data for the individual municipality by clicking this button or the state data as well. We also have this other button that seems a little mysterious, but we think that data literacy is important, and we're working with survey data, and so we'd like to provide you with all the information and all the caveats about using survey data. And so if you're not familiar with margins of error or statistical errors, it's okay. We've got some links and resources here for you as well. So let's just take a spin through a couple more of these topics. So let's take a look at building permit information under housing production. And you can see from the building permit survey, which is reported by municipalities to the Census Bureau, your permitting over time. And so here's Cambridge's. You'll see a lot of 5 or more units because it's Cambridge. But if you went somewhere else, randomly, not randomly, thanks for a conversation yesterday. Ashland is a less urban community, but is also seeing some good housing production. So you can kind of see your historic permitting over time. I'm just going to click through one more. So let's look at school enrollment. This is one of our more popular data sources, and because schools come up a lot, and we'll be talking about that in our role-playing exercise in a little bit. But this information comes from the Department of Education and not only gives you overall enrollment, but the types of schools that children in your community are enrolled in. All right, let's move on to our second mode, which is compare communities. All you need to do is click that toggle button like I just did, and you can start just typing communities in here. I'm going full chaos mode here. You're probably going to want to be a little bit more careful and thoughtful in your selections for comparison. And once you've got a few in there, you can just, once again, all the data is updated on the back end of the site, and you can start browsing. So let's look at cost burden by tenure, another commonly viewed data source on our site. And you can start to draw some conclusions about this. You see renter cost burdens on the left side and owner cost burdens on the right side, and you can compare relative amounts in each of those categories. And you can see that Barnstable has relatively more cost burden renter households than Ashby, and that on the whole, all of these communities have more cost burden renters than cost burden owners. And so you can start to really easily get to those insights and be able to share them with others as well. All right, let's click through a couple more of these. So let's just do one more in the interest of time. Commute mode, if I can click on it. You can see places like Belmont that are closer to the Boston inner core. You're seeing more public transit ridership. You're seeing more multimodal efforts. And again, just want to draw your attention. You can download this chart as well. If you want to choose different communities, you can just keep adding them and watch the chart grow. And so it's pretty flexible and adaptable as you start exploring and wanting to see different things. Okay, so I'm going to do the tricky thing again and navigate back to our PowerPoint. Actually, if we could save questions for the end, that would be great. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So we've gotten through site demo. I'd love to show you just a couple examples of how some of our partners are using Datatown in the field. And so here we have Cindy Napoli. She's several years ago started making a connection between declining enrollment and low permitting rates in her town of Littleton. We have Lieutenant Governor Driscoll from when she was mayor of Salem talking about the relationship between recent building activity and affordability in Salem. And we have Sean Tierney talking about population change in Arlington and how, despite recent growth, that was kind of a high-profile conversation in the community, the town was still well below peak population levels. So great insights, drawing insights from a data chart and making that personal story to their municipality. All right, that's all I have on Datatown. So let's head into some background on our other website with Mattia. He's going to talk us through Residensity.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, I'm just going to give you all a quick overview of our website, Residensity, and a little overview of its features. So Residensity is an interactive web tool that we released back in February of 2023. And Residensity allows you to explore housing unit counts and residential density for any location in Massachusetts. So it's a public resource that we created to aid in housing policy discussions, specifically conversations around land use, zoning, and housing development. Residensity relies on a massive data set of over 2 million parcel records with unit count estimates and use descriptions. And this whole data set, it was developed in-house by the team at Center for Housing Data. So we're really proud of this website. It was a lot of effort in the making. So starting off with just an overview of the features, what can you do with Residensity? So as I mentioned, you can explore unit counts, use descriptions, and residential density for any individual address in the state. You can also explore neighborhood level density by drawing custom districts or neighborhood areas anywhere on our map and receive an estimate of the total number of units, neighborhood level density, and a breakdown of land uses. Lastly, you can also export color-coded maps of residential density as PDFs, and you can also download the raw data straight out of the website if you want to use it in another analysis software. So if you're a GIS user, you can download a shapefile like this one just straight out of the site, or you can download the data tables that has all of the individual parcel records with all the information that we include, like unit counts, use descriptions, and so on. And just a little bit of background. So we created Residensity because there was a growing need to accurately measure residential density in Massachusetts. This came in large part due to the MBTA community zoning law, which many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. The final guidelines for compliance, they required MBTA zoning districts to have a minimum gross density of about 15 units per acre. But there are clear gaps in evaluating residential density in our state, both for community members, housing advocates, and local officials. So what does 15 units per acre really look like? How dense is your neighborhood? How dense is my neighborhood? We wanted to help answer questions like that, and so we created Residensity as a vehicle for answering those types of questions. And just to back up a little bit, with Residensity, it becomes a little bit easier to ground conversations on housing density with real-world examples and data. And while housing density can at times be a controversial topic, we believe that a good mix of residential densities can greatly benefit our neighborhoods by offering a variety of housing options, more opportunities for affordability by increasing housing supply, more diverse communities with units that are accessible to families and first-time home buyers, increased walkability, transit accessibility, and decreased climate impact. And of course, density isn't one size fits all, but with Residensity, it becomes a little bit easier to ground conversations on housing density, again, with data and real-world examples. So these are just a few, oh shoot. Got my notes mixed up. So it's helpful to see different levels of density across different neighborhoods. And these are some quick neighborhood analyses that we pulled together using Residensity. So on the right is an example from Malden Center. The neighborhood is at roughly 26 units per acre, and you can kind of see from a bird's eye view what that looks like. So there's a real mix of uses, from single-family homes, 2- and 3-family, to some larger high-rise developments. On the right here, left. On the left, it's an example that we pulled from Webster, Massachusetts. And it's a neighborhood with about 10 units per acre. Again, we pulled this information from Residensity. And 10 units per acre is actually pretty dense for a community with only 20,000 people. And again, you can see like what that level of density offers to that neighborhood. So there's a real variety of housing types. There's some single-family homes, again, some higher density, some apartment buildings. It's a little bit more spaced out, but there's still a wide variety of uses. So it's just interesting to explore these kinds of things and to see how your neighborhood breaks down, and Residensity makes that kind of analysis really easy to do. And with that, I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint and just give you all a quick tour of Residensity and an example of how we might use Residensity here in Worcester. So this is Residensity. There's a little bit of coaching text when you open up the site, but I'm just going to jump straight into it. So what you can see in Residensity, this view is a map of all of Massachusetts, and all the communities are color-coded by the average level of density in the community. So you can kind of see, where we would expect higher density to be in greater Boston, in the nearby suburbs, and then in our bigger gateway cities like Worcester, Lowell, and so on. These are the places that stand out. So if you want to zoom in and take a look at density in a specific neighborhood, all you really have to do is zoom deeper into the map. And sorry, I'm struggling with the zoom a little bit. And you can get this kind of view. So this is Worcester, where we are right now, right by the commuter station. And you can kind of see the distribution of density all around the area we're in now. So again, the darker parcels, they correlate to higher levels of density, and the lighter parcels correlate to lower levels of density. And what you can do, a straightforward way of using Residensity is you can just plug in a random address. So this is one that I found yesterday. It's a larger development here in Worcester, 27 Mount Vernon Street, and it's a larger multifamily development. So once you search up an address, what you can do is you can click on any individual parcel, and you can get information on that parcel. So 27 Mount Vernon Street here in Worcester, we have a standardized use description field, so it'll tell you it's an apartment with over 8 units. It has an estimated 175 residential units. The parcel is relatively large. It's a 5.45 acre parcel, and that parcel has a residential density of about 32 units per acre. There's a little bit more information here, and I encourage you all to take a look and explore. But with residency, you can find information on any individual address, and you can do some other analyses, so you can just see what's in the neighborhood. Right nearby, there's a single-family home. This is 44th Channing Street at about 2.33 units per acre. And you can keep exploring. So this is another apartment development right nearby, 16 Windsor Street. It has 9 units. It's an apartment with 4 to 8. Oops. That might not be right. With a density of 37 units per acre. Lastly, I just want to show our neighborhood analysis feature. So what you can do in Residency is you can draw a polygon anywhere on the map, and it'll tell you exactly how dense that neighborhood is using the data provided in the site. So I'm just going to draw a really quick district around 27 Vernon Street that I was just looking at. And so let's call this my district. This is my neighborhood. If I click on my neighborhood, this is what happens. So it'll give you just a view showing just the parcels you selected, and it'll give you some breakdown information on the district you selected. So in this neighborhood, there are about 810 residential units over just under 60 acres, giving it a neighborhood density of 13.6 units per acre. And so these are the kind of analyses you can do anywhere. You can do it in your neighborhood. You can do much larger areas than this and get all this kind of information. So if you're looking at a new zoning district, this is a great way of exploring what's already there and taking stock of the different kinds of land uses you have in your community. The last thing that I would share is straight out of the site, you can also export the data, as I mentioned. So if you want to download, if you're a GIS user and you want to download all of these parcels, and if you want to download the district that you drew, you can just click the shapefile button and it'll create a zip folder that contains 2 shapefiles, one that has all of the parcels and another that contains the district that you drew. And you can import it into your GIS software of choice. You can also download data tables of all the information captured here. And just one last thing that I wanted to mention, I skipped over this, but when you draw a district, Residency will also give you a parcel breakdown of the different land uses in your district. This might be a little bit hard to see, but basically it'll rank them by the total number of residential units in your district. So in this district you can see that there's a majority of units that belong to apartments with over 8 units. The next most common use is 3-family, followed by 4 to 8 unit apartments, single family, and 2-family. So again, just a straightforward way of interacting with this data set. That's really the goal of the site Residency. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at the site and give it a spin in your communities. I've already heard from some folks here that they've been using it in their planning meetings, which is always super encouraging for us to hear. So with that, I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint. And I'm just going to give a few more examples of how folks are using Residency out in the wild. So this is an example we heard of from Braintree, Massachusetts. Councilor Meredith Boricki, who's actually being recognized at the Housing Institute with an MHP Housing Hero Award. She's been using Residency to inform her constituents about existing levels of density in Braintree. So she was able to highlight several examples of relatively higher density in Braintree to show community members that the levels of density required in the MBTA zoning guidelines are in line with existing developments they already have in Braintree. And this helped make the case that the guidelines would simply allow for more moderate density housing in the right places. And last December, Braintree Town Councilors, they approved the new overlay district to comply with the zoning law, so we're just super happy that Residency could be a part of their planning process. Next, I wanted to share an example from a housing advocate, Jonathan Burke, who used Residency to share this analysis on Twitter. So Jonathan shows how residential density decreases as you head north on the Newburyport MBTA commuter line. And basically, you can see, it's a little bit hard to see, but what the analysis shows is that the farther out you go on the Newport line, the densities surrounding the commuter stations get lower and lower. So starting with Salem and then going farther out. Salem, as you can see, has a density of about 10 units per acre, whereas Hamilton and Wenham, they go down to about 1.3 units per acre. And we really like analyses like this because they're grounded in things that we're familiar with. And it's just a great way of using residentity. And then the last example I want to share, this is from one of our users who gave us some feedback on Twitter, but he basically told us that residentity helped him have information to bring to his first ever public meeting that he attended. And he shared that residentity was able to give him some examples of existing density in his communities to assuage some of the concerns of residents that the new MBTA communities zoning requirements were a little too ambitious. So just getting this type of feedback was really encouraging for us, and it made us feel like, you know, if we're bringing data to the public and people are using it, you know, to support conversations about housing in their communities, then we're doing the right thing. So that's all been really exciting for us. So anyway, with that, we're going to switch to thinking about how we can use data to drive constructive community conversations. And for that, I'll pass it back to Tom.
Thank you, Mattia. Let me try to speak into the microphone this time. So thanks for that overview and demo. So we've just reviewed 2 of those sites. We're going to go back and revisit the idea of the pivot, and we're going to practice it through a few hypothetical exercises. And this is where we're going to ask you to share some of your experience and share some of your thoughts, too, on how to communicate using data or to respond to some difficult comments in a public meeting. So here's a reminder of the slide that Ellen shared earlier. Again, we want to stick to our values on the right, and we want to avoid getting distracted by refuting things that don't correspond with our framework. So keep that in mind. So let's jump into our first example. This might look familiar to some of you. Popular show among planners and municipal workers. So let's pretend you're at a local meeting, you're talking about a housing plan or a proposed development, and someone like Billy Eichner in this episode of Parks and Recreation comes right up on stage and says in your face, multifamily housing will tank our schools and our budgets with all of those new kids. So imagining this scenario is probably pretty easy. You've been there, done that. But next time this happens, you've listened to this presentation, and you knew this question was coming, and you went to Datatown and you prepared for it. So you've been to Datatown, and you know that school enrollment has been declining in your community like it has in this example in Weston. You also know that your population skews older, like it does in this example from Deerfield, and that you have relatively fewer children aged 5 to 14 in your community than overall state levels. You also see that your housing stock is almost completely single-family homes, like here in Littleton, and you suspect that not only is that lack of housing diversity leading to a lack of socioeconomic diversity, but it's also likely contributing to the decline in school-aged children you've observed because new families can't come into your community. But you're researching, and you found kind of an inconvenient fact for your frame. You see that despite declining enrollment, your town's education expenses are not only your largest expense, but they're growing. And so you've got a little bit of a conflict here. I'd love to encourage you not to see that as an moment. You've got to embrace this inconvenient information because it's an opportunity to acknowledge reality and maybe find some common ground at a point that you can work from. So maybe you can understand Billy a little bit better. Maybe Billy's worried about budget, and maybe he should be. We should all be worried about our municipal budgets. So yes, it's true that our budget is impacted by increasing education costs, but these increases, now we know, are not due to additional children in the system. And perhaps tax revenue generated by new housing can alleviate some of those cost pressures in your schools. All right, so you've done your research. Let's tie it all together with a little reminder. Let's go through the steps that Ellen laid out earlier. We're going to identify Billy's frame, that new housing is going to be a net loss for the town, and that he will personally be impacted by the costs associated with educating new children. We're going to find a shared value in that frame. So for you, maybe that is an agreement that, yeah, education costs are increasing. Or maybe you can agree that age demographics really are an important thing for us to look at carefully and consider when we're making local decisions. And then we're going to use that shared value to make a bridging statement and pivot back to our own values and support those values with information that you absorbed during your data work, and hopefully push the rest of the conversation into that frame. So here's a couple of examples of how I might respond. So like Billy, I'm also worried about age demographics in our community. We have had trouble bringing in new families, and our school enrollment has dropped as a result. If we can't regenerate our community with new families and children, we run the risk of becoming an aging community with fewer prospects for the future. So hopefully that redirects you towards something more productive. Alternatively, maybe there's a more personal element of this for you. And, you know, as a planner, you may want to be careful about weighing in too much on your personal experience and not seeming fair. But I think it's important to show people where you're coming from and talk a little bit about that personal experience too. So you might say, we do have great schools, and that's why I moved here, and that's why it's been so important for me to live in a community where children can thrive. My adult child is now looking for a home here and would love for their own kids to go to school, but they are unable to find an affordable place to live. And I support multifamily housing because my family is important to me, and they need different housing options than what we have to offer. So that's just one example. Maybe it sounds a little clinical. I was reading off a screen. Would love to hear from some of you about your experience. Have you faced this comment before? Have you seen a response backfire? Do you have another idea for how we might be able to pivot and talk about these things and reframe them into a more positive space? So, sorry, thank you, Emma. So hands, please.
Got it. Right, so when I was working in Tingsboro, I did go into Datatown looking for, specifically actually I was into residency trying to find examples. So while I did run into a sort of an uh-oh moment in terms of trying to find surrounding community examples of the density that MBTA Communities was offering, I did my own pivot where we went in and looked for specific information from the Department of Education. So every community's school budgets are published and include information broken down by category. So what I've found is in a lot of cases where the next thing that Billy says, up at town meeting is they quote the per pupil education cost. And they say, well, if you're going to be adding 200 units and we've got 2 kids per unit and then we're educating our kids at $17,000 a pupil, they do the math and you come up with some astronomical number. But we all know that there's an incremental cost associated with adding students that doesn't add up to the per pupil education cost. So we took the data and tried to make reasonable, assumptions about what are fixed costs and what are variable costs to come up with, and then we also broke down the cost of educating a student based on state aid and local tax revenue. And you end up with a number that is approximately 1/3 of what people typically quote. So while it's not direct information from Datatown or Residency, I just wanted to point out there is other solutions within data and other sources. And I'd potentially encourage Datatown to consider breaking down more granular data that's coming from school district budget information that is made publicly available.
Great, thank you. A lot there. Thank you for the suggestion on Datatown. We are always taking input for new ideas. I think that's a great idea to expand on that section on enrollment a little bit so it gives a little more context. Also, yes, please use other data sources. Gosh, we've got 2 websites, but there's a world of information out there. So do whatever research you think is going to help you build your case towards that positive framework. I also like what you said about predicting the next question, because you know this won't work, right? You're going to say one statement, but 2 things to remember. One is you're not necessarily trying to convince Billy. you're thinking about everybody else in the room, right, who may or may not agree with Billy. You're talking to the person who might be shy about standing up and speaking about their values, and you're performing that and demonstrating that leadership so that other people can feel comfortable doing that too. And I think one of the things we've seen with MBTA communities is, gosh, when one person stands up, it can really inspire others to kind of stand up and speak to their values too. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts? We've got another example of this exercise coming up. So, oh, I see a hand back there. Let's do one more.
When trying to, analyze municipal impacts, one source that I use is called eConsult Solutions. So they do a lot with residential demographic multipliers. So when that person stands up and says, you're going to have 2 kids per unit, they have great data on what kind of people move into housing, and it's broken down per county. So from memory, I want to say it's like 0.35 students per unit. So you can, come back at that guy with an objective source. They're not a housing developer. All they do is data, and say, look, that's way higher than what it's actually going to be. And I think that really kind of helps ground people and bring them back to reality.
For sure. Great example. Thanks. I had not heard of that resource, so I'll go and look that up. Hopefully you do too. I think what I'd push you to do is take that data source and think not just about getting the right answer and putting objective data in, but how do you use that to support a different direction in the conversation? And how do you add some qualitative piece of information to complement that? You pulled that information because you believe something different than the other frame. And so bring that into the conversation as you bring data sources in. Let's do one more, yeah, and then we'll move on to the second example.
We're in the process of updating our housing production document, and one of the things that was done was working with the school board. We went to major multifamily, multi-unit locations, and actually the schools know the addresses, and they can say, in this address, this is the number of students, this is the number of units, this is number of students, or number of bedrooms, number of students. So sometimes that can be helpful in honing in on your community's density of children for the school districts. It's, you can get really good data as opposed to what a developer might say, or, some other statewide metric.
Great, yeah, two great things to grab onto in that. One is that although we have these different departments and sometimes they feel a little bit divided in the work that they do, all these topics are so intimately related. And so going to other sources in your community and getting information right from the source and trying to understand how that component's fitting into your housing conversation is brilliant, right? We should all be doing that as much as possible. The one thing I do want to say, especially about school enrollment, is hearkening back to some of the comments we heard yesterday. This is a fair housing issue. We cannot discriminate based on age when we're talking about housing. And so, yes, have these responses, have this data in hand, but be careful you're not taking the conversation to a place that's should we or shouldn't we educate children, right? You do actually need to stand up for that at a certain point and not try to convince people with the right piece of data that won't be convinced. You've got to affirm those values and stand behind them too. So, okay, let's go to our second example. Ellen's going to coach us through that one.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your own experience with some of these messages. So we've got our second one. So maybe you are out at a community meeting, excuse me, about a new multifamily zoning bylaw, and another community member, Moira, whose voice is in my head, but I will not be sharing that with all of you. And she stands up and says, multifamily housing will destroy our town's character. So we've heard this, but we've been to Data Town, we've done our research from all of our sources, we're prepared, and we know that our community's character is composed of its people. And the community is comprised here mostly of white people and homeowners. So when we're looking here in Data Town at Marblehead, we see that 79% of people in town are homeowners compared to 63% in Massachusetts as a whole. And the town is very racially homogenous, with white people representing well over 3/4 of the population. So what are we really talking about when we talk about character? And if we value diversity in our community, we need to understand how our housing decisions have an impact on who is able to live here. So thinking more about those housing decisions, we can further use data to understand what our homes look like and share the message that multifamily housing is in fact already part of our town's character. So here in Cohasset, now we have a disproportionately high share of single-family housing compared to the state as a whole, but multifamily housing and the families who make their home there are already part of the town's character. So Datatown shows us that about 20% of the town's housing stock is multifamily homes. So knowing that housing composition and from Datatown, we can then look to residentity to learn more about our land use patterns. So residentity confirms that most parts of Cohasset are low density, as we would expect with such a preponderance of single-family homes. But the area around Main Street, one of the most charming parts of town, has a variety of housing types, including mixed-use buildings. So in fact, one of the areas emblematic of the town's character has some of that multifamily housing contributing to its vibrancy. And now we can bring community character back to the people. So looking now at Braintree, Datatown shows us that like in many communities, renter household income is dramatically lower than owner household income, with about half of renters having that income under $50,000 compared to 15% of owners, and a similar share of renter households facing housing cost burdens. So where does all this data lead us? Increasing the supply of rental housing can help alleviate price pressures facing too many families in town. And exploring residentity shows us that the area of town around the commuter rail and the Red Line stations in Braintree may be underutilized. So the west side of the tracks include a diverse mix of housing types at a relatively high density, even for single-family homes. But the land on the east side is largely used for commercial and industrial purposes, generally older office, retail, and warehouse buildings. So some of this land may be appropriate for redevelopment as residential or mixed-use property. And in fact, planners and community members in Braintree identified districts within this station area as overlay districts for their MBTA community zoning that's currently under review by the state. So they located 2 of their 4 proposed districts on the east side of the tracks within this half-mile zone, plus a third adjacent district on the west side. So combined, these 2 districts cover just under 176 acres, and Braintree's calculations using the MBTA Communities Compliance Model, developed by the Center for Housing Data, show a unit capacity of just under 3,000 units at a density of between 16 and 22 units per acre, depending on the zone. So, well, we all know that how many units are ultimately built in these zones will be impacted by a whole variety of things. Residentity reminds us that these density levels of 16 to 22 units per acre are well in line with existing multifamily density in the neighborhood, while providing more housing opportunities for price-pressured renters in the community. So again, thinking back to our pivot, we hear from Moira that multifamily housing will destroy our town's character, and we can lead with our own values and experience, backed up by the facts, and think about how we might respond. So this could sound something like, I care a lot about our community's character too. That's one of the reasons I think it's a great place to live. And it's important to be clear what we each mean when we talk about character. So right now, one element of our community's character is exclusionary. We're lacking much of that racial and socioeconomic diversity that make communities vibrant and strong. And the renters who are part of our community are too often overburdened by housing costs. So we can make the most of all the positive parts of our local character, like our walkable Main Street, our access to public transit, and our mixed-use areas of housing, shopping, and recreation, to make smart decisions about our future growth and make our community more affordable and accessible to all of our residents. So we wanted, again, to open it up to all of you and see if you've heard another message like this out in your community meetings, how you've responded to that, or if you did hear this message, what types of data would you want to bring to this conversation to get back to your own positive message?
Hi, Ian Burns with the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. First, I'll just say all of the data resources have been like a lifeline for us at times, so thank you so much to all of your staff for putting them together. a couple things we talk about here, depending on the community we're in. Number one, we have a few rural communities that really care about their open space and their farmland. And so one of the things we talk about is that you actually need density to preserve that open space. And so folks get concerned about losing farmland, losing open space. We talk about the need to densify in certain areas and preserving at the same time, always pairing that development and preservation conversation together. The other thing that we've noticed a lot is speaking to the downtowns, people also identify characters with their little cafe or their restaurant or even their school system, and who's working in all those cafes, in the schools, in the restaurants, in the little retail shop. It could be and tends to be renters and people that need multifamily housing stock and more affordable solutions. And so we talk about that to keep that character. You need people that are going to be in those jobs in your town, and so you need that housing stock to support them.
Thank you. I think we can also open it up now to any other question. If there's another. Perfect.
Between this and the last point, one thing that we found when we were doing our MBTA communities town meeting article, obviously, as we know, some people just will not be convinced by data, no matter how accurate it is and how much we throw at them. They're just not convinced. So personal stories was a big part of our strategy. I had talked about in a few different presentations how we go through different stages of life in multifamily housing. A lot of us have lived in multifamily housing at some point, whether it's your first apartment or people downsizing, kids getting out of college wanting to stay in their own community, or if a family goes through a divorce and they both want to stay within the same community. So we tried to highlight how important it was to have all these different options for people in our community. And some of the speakers that were lined up for town meeting with some of the advocates in town talked about how were people who actually had moved into new multifamily and condominiums that were developed in town, and they were very happy with it and how it really fit where their situation was in life. So that personal angle really helped people to identify with it.
Absolutely, thank you. We think that's incredibly valuable to have that narrative, that personal connection. Yep. I think Emma's coming up.
Thank you so much for this. I have a question about the ACS data that you're using in the data town. I noticed, it was on the screen fairly briefly, but it looks like it's the 2016 to 2020 ACS data. Are you updating that? Because we're using our 2022 data set, so it would be difficult for us to go back and use that tool with an old data set. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me? Yes. Great question. Good eye. Yes, the data on DataTown is a couple cycles older. So part of the reason for that is because we are hard at work developing some enhancements to the site that will keep the data fresher, faster, and easier on our end from a mechanics perspective. And we made the choice to kind of shift gears towards new development rather than, it's honestly kind of an onerous update process, the old system. Because some of this data doesn't change very quickly on the town level, especially from ACS version to ACS version. ACS actually counts 5 whole years of data. So even when you're using the 2022 data, you're looking at 2018 data in the mix as well. And so, yeah, fair point. We are trying to keep the site as up to date as possible. So yes, updates coming. Yes, please.
Follow-up question is just from Martha's Vineyard. So on the Cape and Islands, on the Cape and Islands, we've actually seen our data change dramatically from the 2016 data set to the new data set. So I'm wondering, on behalf of, I know we have some folks from Brewster and Nantucket here too, what is the ETA on the new data set being updated? Because we're working really hard with within our own towns, using our own data sets to advance policy and changes. But if we could tap into this tool and have the current data sets, I think it would streamline everything for all of us. So what is your ETA on that update?
Not prepared to give you an exact date,
okay.
But going to thank you for your advocacy. This is important for us to hear, so thank you. And if there's a short-term need that you have around data around a specific meeting, please reach out and we can help you as much as we can.
In our community, we have a strong core of people, multifamily housing, especially mixed use in our village centers. The parking is going to be worse and traffic and nobody will be able to move. So I'm wondering how we can use both of these platforms to address that argument.
Sure. So I think one of the ways we can do that is kind of leave that point there, something that we've talked a little bit about today and we heard about yesterday as well, that some people are always going to think that the parking is going to be horrible no matter what, and maybe sometimes of the day it is. So kind of pulling out traffic studies or anything else isn't necessarily going to convince them. So I think it's bringing it back to what's so valuable about having that in your town. So all of us love to spend time downtown in our town center on our main street. Being able to walk there is important to me too. So I'm excited to be working together on how we can make sure there's more transit access there, so we can be bringing in more new development to keep it a vibrant town center that all of us can walk around in and enjoy.
Just want to add one thing there, and it's that traffic's already bad, right? And so it's a problem whether or not we build the housing, and we can't have one problem stand in the way of addressing another one. We've got to do these things in concert. So maybe that's an opportunity to kind of say, yes, traffic's hard. We've all got cars. It's tough to find a spot to park. Sympathize a little bit, because we've all been there, right? How many of you sat in traffic today, this morning, and yesterday, right? It's not fun for anybody. So sometimes even addressing that, hey, it's a hardship getting around. Mobility is really tough, and we've confined ourselves to cars and finding a place to park right where we want to go. That's a standing problem with or without this 20-unit building down the street. And so sometimes just decoupling one issue from the direct thing that you're talking about can start to change the mood or the tone around that issue. One hand in the back there in the corner.
Thank you. I was just wondering, in using the residency tool, which I haven't explored yet, so thank you for this demonstration, is there a way that the tool differentiates between mixed-use properties? So if you're grabbing a neighborhood that you want to do an analysis, is it just counting every footprint as residential, or is it coded so that it extracts the commercial?
Hear me? Okay. Yeah, so the short answer is yes. We do differentiate between different types of mixed use. The way we go about that is, one thing that I didn't touch on in the residency portion of the presentation, but the methodology relies on all of the assessors' use codes and use descriptions that we take and then standardize down to a set from about 2,000 plus unique use codes and use descriptions to about 40. When we summarize down for mixed use, we take a lot of consideration into keeping as much information in those parcels as possible. So some will be mixed use, residential with commercial, mixed use, I don't know. Mixed use, it'll be like industrial and residential and so on. So we go into a lot of detail there, and if you explore the site, also feel free to reach out to us. I'm happy to give you a one-on-one coaching on using the site, but you can really get into a really high level of detail on the site around mixed-use properties. And we do take some time to make sure we're not counting the commercial address as a residential address. So the data is also generally very accurate on the mixed-use properties as well.
Just want to add that mixed-use properties are so hard to work with in the data, because the data doesn't tell you how much is residential or commercial. So we've developed some formulas and some materials to make our best guess, but it's not always 100% accurate. So this is a plug to all of you. One of the things we rely on in residency is if we've got something wrong, if we've got your high-profile mixed-use development wrong in the system, please tell us. We will go in and we will verify that and we will fix it. You're all part of this site too. It's for you all. And so let's together make sure that it's an accurate representation of our communities. All right, great. One more.
Hello. I think what we've faced is that the general public has a hard time believing that increased stock helps stabilize costs. So if there's any good examples as to how that's been proven, because we can't really use Dallas and Austin, Texas as an example, right, in Reading. So it's hard to explain to people how that works. New development is expensive, right? But over time, in different size and scale, and even past trends when the gap was smaller, there was a lot of single-family homes being built, and land costs were different at the time and things. So there's no perfect correlation. So if there's any good examples as to how we're projecting that the stock increase will help stabilize costs, I think that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, this question is so tough, and it came up a little bit yesterday too. And yeah, we do point to those same like 2 or 3 studies that have come out that have taken this really macro lens of regional housing prices, and that is just really tough material to communicate to an individual who's trying to weigh in on a housing development or a zoning plan. And so I think that we can't have it be all or nothing on mitigating costs. We're building this housing for a variety of reasons, and we're building it because there's a deep need. And yeah, maybe it's not going to be as affordable as we'd like it to be. Maybe we can use points like that to advocate for the maximum amount of affordability we can make work in the project. But we also have to put affordability side by side with some of the other benefits of housing development, right? And even if it's more expensive than some people can afford, it's a place to live, right? And people really desperately need that. And so I think it's really tempting when someone says something like that, and this is like the art of the pivot, right? You have to recognize that there's an element of truth in that we've seen a lot of building maybe in your community, and prices are still going up. And what's a deeply unsatisfying answer is, well, they'd be going up even more if we didn't, right? Like, even though that might be true, it's not compelling or necessarily satisfying to communicate. And so I'd say just try to diversify the way you're talking about the goals of the development, because mitigating housing costs for the entire state or a region is not going to get somebody in your community necessarily to stand up and say yes. So find the things they care about and try to attach your conversation to those.
And just one more point on that. Massachusetts as a whole, like our level of permitting is really low compared to most other states. And same with that, our housing stock is also really old. So, you know, we can combat new development as much as we want, but the reality that we're facing is that we're not developing much housing. To some people, it feels like we're developing too much housing, but the real issue is, you know, there hasn't been much development and most of our stock is really old. So I think you can't necessarily make the case that if we add all this housing, all of a sudden, you know, there's no more demand pressure on our market, and all of a sudden, like, housing is affordable to everybody. But it's definitely a step in the right direction, and it's a part of our communities growing and changing, just like everywhere else is growing and changing. You can't live in a place that was built in like 1905 for 300 years. It's I don't know, unless if you really take great care of it, but most of us do, exactly. But
All right. I think we've got time for one more.
Does your data set with respect to multi-unit differentiate between those set aside, both subsidized and non-subsidized, for seniors specifically set aside? The reason I ask is in our town, you know, the schools are crowded, but we really need senior housing. Yeah.
are you asking for residency? Or
Not single-family residence, multifamily. In your data set,
Both
is there any indication?
there's some indication that is sometimes available in the assessor's data. Sometimes the assessors will specify, like with a little bit more detail, what parcel of land is used for. So sometimes they will say it's affordable housing for senior purposes. That's not something we're able to boil down to at our level of.
Okay, thanks.
But we will definitely keep an eye on that. Maybe there's a way of
think it'd be
incorporating
helpful.
data. Definitely.
And just a plug, if you're not aware of Housing Navigator, it's a wonderful organization, wonderful site. They have done so much work to compile as comprehensive a database as we've ever had on affordable and subsidized units. And they recently, I think just earlier this year, released a little data explorer that will let you see some level of information about the affordable housing in your town and some of the restrictions involved. So check out that site. If it's not giving you quite what you're looking for, reach out to us. We'd love to hear more specifically about your use case and whether or not that's something we can add. All right, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you to the Center for Housing Data team for walking us through that. I love this stuff. I love the art of the pivot. If you haven't read the case made by Dr. Tiffany Manuel, it's a real, it's an eye-opener for how to do this work. And I will also say the art of the pivot, it gets easier the more you practice. So do this at home. Imagine what you're going to hear and practice it. All right, so we have a quick break. Just a couple of quick reminders for you. All of the materials, I know some of the slides can be hard to see. All of the materials are in your binder, all of the slides, so please take a look at that. And Wachusett Room C, so that's the tent, again, reminder, is where you'll be going for the supportive housing conversation. And in here will be a session on tackling the housing shortage and climate crisis together. So we'll see you back at 10:30. Thanks. I did, yeah. Yeah, it's okay. We'll get there. There we go. Yes. We also, I think we should remove the reserve sign, Emma, because no one's sitting that front table. Our sessions are going to start in just 1 minute, so if folks could make their way to the room that they want to be in, we'll be getting started just in a second here.
I don't want to be blocking you. Let me know if I'm blocking you. Okay.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Lauren Bauman. I am the newly minted Director of Sustainability and Climate Initiative at MHP, and I'm super happy to be here this morning with Julie and Angela talking about the opportunity of amenity-oriented high-performance developments and how they can really help us address issues of the housing shortage and the climate crisis simultaneously. So climate change has long been an existential threat to people and the planet, but in recent years, we're seeing the impacts of the climate crisis really hitting closer to home. Extreme weather events in the last few years have increased exponentially. In the years between 1960 and 1989, FEMA recorded 7 weather-related major disasters or declarations in Massachusetts. Between 1990 and 2019, that number went up to 23. So from this smattering of sort of news events here, you know, this is just an example of some of the extreme weather events that we dealt with here in Massachusetts just last year in 2023. So you can see extreme precipitation and flooding events with significant infrastructure and property damage, multiple tornado touchdowns, and air quality impacts. So for things that are climate related that aren't even in our state, we're seeing the impacts on health and indoor air quality in our state. So climate models are predicting that we're going to have continued increases in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. And these are going to create damage to community infrastructure and threaten populations that are already vulnerable to climate hazards and other stressors. And so here is some information from the 2023 Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan that really drives home some of the impacts that we are most likely to experience as a result of climate change in the Commonwealth. So as people have been recognizing this, we're seeing a real increase in the amount of attention being given to the climate crisis at the state level. And so here's just sort of a summary of some of the kind of big actions, legislative as well as organizational that have happened at the state level in the last handful of years. One of the most impactful was in 2021, the creation of an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. So this was really the legislature's attempt at codifying the state's long-term emissions limits of net zero emissions by 2050. And it directs the adoption of a 2030 emissions limit at 50% below 1990 levels and a 2040 emissions limit of at least 75% below 1990 levels. Within the context of that act, we also saw the legislation that created the creation of the opt-in specialized energy code, which we're going to talk about a little bit more moving forward. But since then, we've seen sort of a promulgation of state-level planning around climate change mitigation. So Clean Energy Climate Plan that was released in 2022, which was really a result of that legislation and created the plan for achievement of economy-wide limits to emissions reduction. So really the steps that we need to take to get to those emissions thresholds in the sort of near and long term. And then, we just saw some information from the 2023 Resilient Mass Plan, which is really a response to the fact that we know that the impacts of climate change, even if we work very hard to mitigate them moving forward, we are still going to feel those impacts in our communities, and making sure that we are navigating climate mitigation as well as climate adaptation and protecting communities and infrastructure from these impacts. Another really important step that was taken very recently, on the first day of her administration, Governor Healy created an Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience within the governor's office and appointed Melissa Hoffer as the first climate chief at the state level. And her job is really to make sure that climate change is an issue that is addressed across the executive offices in decision making, just understanding that it is one of these critical cross-cutting issues that has to be considered in a lot of other decision making as well. More recently, we've seen the update to our energy codes, which include our base energy code, as well as our stretch energy code, which many of the municipalities in the Commonwealth were part of, and then the creation of that specialized energy code, which really is the energy code that gets our new construction buildings on the path towards our 2050 emissions reduction goals. And then more recently, folks may have seen that the EEAC recently released a draft of their 3-year plan, the Mass Save 3-year plan. So this is the 3-year plan that the utilities use to govern their energy efficiency incentive programs. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at that and comment on that. But there is a strong focus now of the program administrators to align their offerings with the state's climate emissions reduction goals and requirements. So here's a graph that's from the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. So this is sort of the near-term planning document that the state is using. And what I'd like you to notice is that transportation and buildings are a vast majority of our emissions in Massachusetts. And so strategies to achieve emissions reductions have to have successful pathways for addressing both of these sectors. So we have to improve the performance of our building stock and tackle the transportation sector at the same time. And so that's going to necessitate things like vehicle electrification, which we're seeing a lot of movement on at this point, but also reduction in the total number of vehicle miles traveled. And so how do we do that? We do that by providing mobility alternatives to the personal vehicle and reducing the overall vehicle miles traveled by individuals to get to the places in their daily living. So at the same time that we're navigating all of these climate crises, as you all are very well aware, we're also navigating a significant housing shortage. In this year's housing report card from the Boston Foundation, Boston metro area is named the 3rd most expensive rental market in the country. Over 50% of renter households are cost burden, meaning more than 30% of their income goes towards rent. And to meet our needs, we know that we have to produce 20,000 homes per year. But we've only achieved this pace 3 times in the past 30 years. We're creating new housing, but it's just simply not enough to keep people here and continue to attract talent. According to the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, more than 46,000 people left the state between 2020 and 2021, often for places with lower cost of living. We have to get our housing costs under control, or we risk losing our most valuable asset at the state, our people. So like we've seen a lot of activity around climate in the last handful of years, we've also seen significant activity around state-level housing actions. Starting with the 2020 Economic Development Bill, which, created the MBTA Communities Act, as well as housing choice legislation. In 2023, at the same time as the climate chief was getting up and running, we also saw the creation of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, executive office specifically dedicated towards tackling these housing challenges. And then more recently, I'm sure folks are tracking the housing bond bill, which, the governor's version was a significant increase in housing investments from the 2018 housing bond bill. There were also executive orders for creation of a statewide housing plan, a commission to unlock housing production, ability to identify surplus public lands for housing, and then a range of other zoning reforms and proposals like the local real estate transfer tax, which I know folks are familiar with where this is going on the version that was passed by the House on June 5th, didn't make the cut. But the good news is that the version of the bill passed by the House on June 5th was about 20 million, I think? 2 million? No, sorry, I have the wrong number. Yeah, 2 million more than the governor's amount, passed it, 2 billion, sorry. Yeah, more than the governor's amount. So significant investment from the House on that as well. And then the 5-year capital investment plan is another $1.5 billion committed to housing initiatives, which really focus on both complementary transportation and climate initiatives. So MHP's vision for the Commonwealth is where everyone, regardless of income, has access to neighborhoods that are rich in jobs, transit, and housing opportunity. We know we have to create 200,000 homes by 2030 to meet the need and increase housing affordability. At the same time, we have to ensure that the new housing is supporting our attainment of our emissions reduction goals to mitigate the negative global and local impacts of climate change. So we're committed to supporting the creation and preservation of complete neighborhoods. We believe by building highly energy efficient housing near transit and other necessary amenities, we're creating healthy and livable communities while addressing our housing and climate challenges. With that, I'd love to turn it over to Julie and Angela to talk in more detail about the important work that they're doing around this to encourage and implement just this type of development.
Okay, can you all hear me? Great. Hi everyone, my name is Julie Curdy. I'm the Director of Clean Energy at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, the regional planning body for the greater Boston area. I just arrived at the conference, so I wanted to just get a sense of who's in the room, if that's okay. So if you're here from a municipality, could you just give me a hand wave? Cool, okay, so we're in good company. If you're here with a housing trust, anybody? Okay. How about a housing developer? Great. Anybody with the state? All right. And private sector folks I haven't mentioned or other? Okay. Great. Well, thanks. That's really helpful to get a sense of who's in the room. And then my other kind of reading the room question is, how many of you are already building sustainable housing, green housing, kind of familiar with this topic? Okay. So a healthy mix. Great. So we look forward to a good discussion here today. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about how MAPC and regional planning agencies work at the intersection of affordable housing and sustainability. So I think I'll just start today with the key takeaways that we want you to come away from this talk from. The first is that housing and climate are connected crises, and we need solutions for both. I think in the past, some have pitted them as competing priorities. We can either build affordable housing or we can build sustainable and climate-friendly housing. And MAPC and others in the room I know want the message to be no, we can do both together. They can complement and support each other, and they need to because, as Lauren shared, we have an affordable housing crisis and a climate crisis in Massachusetts. We also want people to know that energy codes, which we'll talk about in a little bit more, and local housing policy should be considered simultaneously and work together. And probably don't need to say this too much to the folks in the room, but dense, transit-oriented, and high efficiency and green housing are all important priorities to advance at the same time. Let's see. So just to give you a sense of who regional planning agencies are, if you're not familiar, we have 12 in Massachusetts. Ironically, for agencies that do mapping, this isn't an amazing map. But MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, we cover the greater Boston region, 101 cities and towns, roughly a third of the population of the state. And then there's regional planning agencies throughout the Commonwealth. We're all quasi-state organizations. We were started to help advance the capacity of local and municipal governments, providing technical assistance in different topic areas. So traditionally land use. Most RPAs also have housing teams that are really robust, and some have environment and clean energy and climate teams. And so we provide technical assistance to cities and towns. So if you haven't connected with your local RPA, you can see us as a resource in your work. MAPC recently completed its long-term vision for the Metro Boston region called Metro Common 2050. And just to briefly highlight in that vision, we really want to hold up climate change adaptation and mitigation as really important. So here we want to advance a healthy environment, a net zero carbon region, and a climate resilient region. And at the same time, as I noted, we also have a vision that everybody should have a home in our region, and that those homes should be safe and comfortable, they should be affordable, they should meet the needs of residents, and they should also be combined with energy efficiency and climate priorities. So, like I said, MAPC values housing and climate goals, and the work that we're doing is also a response to the current legislation that Lauren raised as well. So just to highlight a few of those, as she noted, we have a next generation climate roadmap, and we have statutory goals in Massachusetts to reduce our carbon emissions by certain years, 50% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors by 2030, and by 2050, an 85% reduction from our baseline levels, ultimately achieving net zero through carbon sequestration as well. And then we also have the MBTA Communities Act that Lauren mentioned that is requiring, as many of you are very familiar with, new zoning to allow multifamily housing by right in communities, and then also housing choice, which hopefully allows zoning changes that advance housing to be easier to enact in municipalities. Just to offer a few shared definitions for what I'll talk about, what Angela and others will talk about. Affordable housing is defined as deed-restricted housing for very low-income or moderate-income residents or households at a cost that doesn't exceed 30% of their monthly gross income. Most affordable housing, as you all know, is built via a public program, so a subsidy or inclusionary zoning type program. There is also naturally occurring affordable housing, but less and less. The stretch code that we'll talk about a little is a code that communities can opt into, an energy code that emphasizes energy performance, and it's designed to result in energy efficiency and cost-effective construction. And then most recently, from one of the recent climate bills that passed, we now have, confusingly, a specialized code in Massachusetts that's an even higher level of energy efficiency standards that a municipality can opt into for new construction only. We'll also talk about passive house here, and I believe Angela will talk about it as well in her examples. And passive house is a voluntary standard for energy efficiency in a building, and it focuses on building a really strong building envelope and using as much energy efficiency as possible to start with a really strong baseline in new construction that then can allow net zero housing or other types of priorities. A net zero energy building is a building that produces as much renewable energy as it uses over the course of the year. And then sometimes you'll hear the term fossil fuel-free building. That's a building with no fossil fuels in it at all for heating, for cooking, for anything else. Each of these terms is a little different. A passive house can also be net zero and fossil-free, and it also cannot be. So it just depends on the context. To highlight a few resources from MAPC that you may find useful, we've worked on advocating for building energy codes for many years until the most recent energy codes came out. The BBRS used to govern building energy codes, and now the Department of Energy Resources does, and which we think is a really positive change, and they're continuing to update the stretch and specialized code every few years. We also did a training series called Health, Housing, Energy, and Equity, and the link is in your, I think, training materials to those recorded webinars, where we have a much deeper dive into this topic than I'll offer today. And then I want to talk next about some of our key findings that we've done. We've been interviewing housing developers, both affordable housing developers and market rate housing developers who focus on multifamily affordable housing in our region, to really understand how are they doing this work? How are they advancing affordable housing and clean energy and energy efficiency at the same time? So some of the key findings from the research that we're doing and talking to developers are that we cannot meet our climate goals, obviously, without building decarbonization. But one of the key takeaways from those discussions is that it is really possible. You can develop affordable housing in Massachusetts, and it can be cost competitive when you integrate climate and deep energy efficiency priorities. And in fact, affordable housing is actually leading on efficiency in our region, more so than market rate housing. Some of that is because the qualified allocation plans that governs LIHTC credits emphasizes sustainability as a priority, as many of you know, and that's a good way to increase your score and get more incentives when you're developing housing. So it's actually the industry standard to build to passive house in the affordable energy arena, or in the affordable housing arena when developing new housing. But now, with the new specialized code that communities can opt into and the updated stretch code, there's a really neat opportunity for municipalities, so all of you in the room, to align standards to basically adopt, either stay in the stretch code or adopt the specialized code, and by doing that, forcing market rate housing up to that higher standard that affordable housing is already at. And doing that is really important because that can help bring the industry along. We know that costs go down in this development. The more people are familiar with standards like passive house, the more vendors and contractors do this work, the more the costs go down to develop, and the more competitive then affordable housing can be to develop compared to market rate housing when we're all being held to the same standards for energy efficiency. And then the focus of envelope performance and passive house certification provides multiple benefits to residents. It just builds really good and comfortable housing. And I think Angela can share more about that. And I'm sure some of you in the room have also built to passive house standards or have been in that type of housing. It's just really high quality for residents and lowers their energy bills, which is really important for residents who are lower income. So as I mentioned before, in our interviews with developers, and then also the Passive House Institute of the US have been studying when you develop to a passive house standard for high energy efficiency, what is the cost premium there? Passive House cites a 1 to 2% cost premium for that development, and that doesn't account for the lower operating costs of that highly energy efficient building in the long run. In our developer interviews, we heard that costs can range from 2 to 10% more as a premium. That was in 2022 at a time of lots of supply chain issues that you may all remember. So costs are coming down further and further. And again, when you underrate or think about the long-term savings of passive house from an energy efficiency standpoint and operational standpoint, it is basically cost competitive or close to housing that's not developed to a passive house standard. So again, we want to dispel the myth that affordable housing can't also meet our climate goals. We can do both, and evidence shows that we can. To highlight, when we did this research in 2022, we did hear from developers that there are some challenges in bigger multifamily buildings in providing domestic hot water that's not heated by gas. So that's a technology solution that's still in the works and that developers are working on trying to make other technologies that are electrified for hot water make sense and pencil out and work from an operational standpoint. And then we did hear from developers that there are regulatory shifts and issues and challenges, of course, with this work. If you ever have tried to interconnect solar with your utility, Eversource, National Grid, or others, you know that that can be a challenge. There's also issues with contractors being familiar with this type of work. And again, the more familiar they get, the more costs can drop. And then there's some resident education, too, about what it's like to live in an all-electric or a passive house building and how to care for and operate those systems from a building operations standpoint. Just to reemphasize, I think I mentioned this before, we hope communities will adopt the specialized code while also taking steps to make affordable housing development easier in your communities. And I have a few suggestions for that type of policy I'll end with. And then we also want to emphasize that dense transit-oriented development is a win-win for climate and affordability priorities. I'm not an expert in building energy codes, but I did want to just kind of highlight or try to provide a slide to make sense because I find it's very wonky and confusing. But basically, we have 3 energy codes in Massachusetts. We have a base code. I believe that's the 2018 International Energy Conservation Commission, IECC Energy Code, and the building BBRS is currently updating that standard. So that's the baseline everybody must comply with in Massachusetts. However, actually, over 300 municipalities in Massachusetts, the vast majority have opted into the stretch code. And Department of Energy Resources recently updated that code. So that's the level that most of us now operate at for new construction and major renovations. There's different categories in the code for what would trigger that type of requirement if you're doing major upgrades in your building. And then most recently, a newest that rolled out last year is the specialized code. And that's kind of one step above the stretch code, and municipalities can choose via a process, either at town meeting if you're a town, or via your city council if you're a city, to opt into this specialized code. And that only applies, to new construction in municipalities, and it's a higher energy efficiency standard that it pushes new buildings towards. And participating in the stretch code and or the specialized code are really key to solving our climate crisis, and again, also to bringing market rate housing on par with what work you all are already doing in affordable housing, already building to passive house and high standards in most cases. This panel is also about amenity-oriented housing or dense and transit-oriented housing, and I think it goes without saying that density leads to lower carbon emissions, mainly because of transportation. So when housing is more dense and people have access to amenities and transportation, they drive less, you have less carbon emissions, and it can also make communities just more livable and pleasant when people can get to their places of work, to their places that they play, to their schools more easily. So I just want to close out by just recommending a few things that those of you who sit in the municipal seat could think about from a policy perspective moving forward, whether you control these levers or could influence elected officials in your cities and towns, or if you're not directly a municipal official, if you want to talk to your municipality about some of these policies if you don't have them already. But the first one I'd hold up is that all plans that your municipality should develop should prioritize climate and housing. They shouldn't be done in silos. So housing production plans that you all are developing, climate action plans, mobility plans, they should speak across and talk to each other and elevate affordable housing and climate priorities at the same time. One example I like to point to of this is the town of Acton and their climate action plan held up affordable housing as a really big priority. When we were helping them develop this plan, the select board actually asked, why is housing in our climate plan? And we talked to them more about it, and that housing connects to climate priorities. People need to live places. If we're going to build new housing in your community, we want it to be climate friendly and as affordable as possible. So it did end up in their plan. And when they recently passed their MBTA community zoning in Acton, they held up their climate action plan and said, this is a priority that we have, and this is why we need to do this zoning, among other reasons. So they made them all talk to each other from a policy perspective, which was really neat. We also recommend that communities adopt the stretch code if you haven't, stay in the stretch code if you already are in it, and consider opting up into the specialized code if that feels like a good fit for your municipality. And again, there's different processes depending on your charter of your municipality for how that works, but typically it's a vote at town meeting if you're a town or your city council. We want to encourage adopting or strengthening inclusionary zoning policies in municipalities. So those are policies that require a minimum amount of affordable housing to be incorporated into new housing developments. And with the 3A zoning, if your community is looking at that through the MBTA Communities Act, you can require up to 10% inclusionary zoning in that, or ask for an exception up to 20% if you work with DHCD on that. There's a whole bunch of things you can do from a planning perspective to make building affordable housing easier that you may all be familiar with. You can expedite permitting and remove a lot of those barriers, improve the floor area ratio that's allowed for affordable housing development, offer height bonuses, going perhaps above regular height requirements in area for affordable housing. I think Angela will talk about this a lot, but you can lower parking requirements, which can help projects pencil out more, still provide the parking people need, but maybe not make it as accessible as it sometimes is in town requirements. And MAPC has a resource on this called Perfect Fit Parking I wanted to point folks towards if you're thinking about the parking regulations your municipality might require, and could we shift those or change those just for affordable housing or across the board to make those projects more cost effective and easy to develop. We also encourage removing restrictive zoning, so thinking about minimum lot sizes your municipality might have, single family zoning, accessory dwelling unit bans. There's a lot of barriers like that exist in municipalities that we can remove and get rid of to make affordable housing and housing development generally just easier. And MAPC has a guide called Living Little I'd point to there specifically about accessory dwelling units and how we can enable those. So if you have a home, an accessory dwelling unit is a smaller unit you might build on the lot as well. It's a great place for older relatives to live, for example. If you want to age in place, it can help solve the issue of, I want to stay in my town, but my children can't afford a home here. You could build an accessory dwelling unit and move there as the parent in the relationship or the grandparent and allow your family to live in the main unit. So that's a really good solution to building more housing. I heard there was a discussion earlier about how we solve the affordability housing crisis, and we just need more housing as one baseline argument. We need all types of housing, and then we need as much affordable housing as possible. We need to do all of these things everywhere, all the time, all at once. I don't have it on the slide, but the other policy solution that's really helpful is an affordable housing overlay that you could have in your community. So that could be rezoning your community to allow affordable housing by right in certain areas or across the community. And again, you could incorporate in that some of these expedited permitting and floor area ratio bonuses at the same time. So kind of looking at the tools of zoning and how can we flex them and use them to prioritize affordable housing and make it happen as much as possible in our municipalities. And then finally in here is a whole bunch of acronym soup about different funding programs, but at the local level, using the Community Preservation Act that your community can opt into to fund affordable housing if you aren't already. There's a lot of state funding sources available via the Department of Energy Resources, that's what DOER is. EEA is the Executive Office of Energy and Environment Affairs. They have a whole bunch of programs. There also is a new climate bank, community climate bank, that just started in Massachusetts that's going to be rolling out new financing programs for affordable housing specifically, and also the Mass Save programs that Lauren mentioned. And then we're keeping our eye on federal resources via the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as well, to define all those acronyms that I should not have put on the slide. And then I'll stop here, but there's links and resources here, and I don't know if there's access to a digital copy too, because I didn't put the actual URLs for these links, but just a whole bunch of resources on this topic I'd point folks towards, and I'm very happy to talk to you afterwards, or you're welcome to connect with me via email or to your other RPA, Regional Planning Agency, about this topic. And our job is to help guide municipalities and partners and point you towards resources and how you can do both, advance both priorities, housing and climate, and in particular at the interface of planning. So we'd love to talk to you and work with you. Okay, I'm all done. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lauren and Julie. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Angela Guile, and I work for Wind Companies. Wind Companies is a large developer and manager of affordable and mixed-income housing. My day-to-day job is overseeing the production and rehabilitation of affordable and mixed-income housing throughout New England. As I'm going to get in here today, increasingly, our affordable and mixed-income housing projects are not only achieving housing production goals, but also achieving a lot of energy efficiency and sustainability goals. And we are doing this a lot at our transit and amenity-oriented developments. The Wind Companies is one of the country's largest also property managers of affordable housing. We have done over 30 historic adaptive reuse projects and countless transit-oriented development projects. So as you have heard about today, and kind of from my perspective as a developer, we've been seeing these accelerating trends from kind of recommendations about what affordable housing could and should be doing to address energy efficiency goals to really more requirements. And we're seeing that through things that were already mentioned today from the federal, state, and local levels, with things like the building codes, zoning codes, funding requirements through QAPs, and even some utility considerations, right? We're now seeing some municipalities or some areas being served by certain utility companies put in natural gas moratoriums, right? So there's a lot of, like, we want to be doing this work, and also it's increasingly that we're being required to do this work. So that's great. A lot of the stuff that my colleagues talked about today is really guiding affordable housing toward being more energy efficient and sustainable. And these are just some examples of that, again, coming all the way from the federal level with minimum energy standards for any affordable project that is touched by HUD, to scoring incentives in QAPs, And again, even things like natural gas moratoriums necessitating us to be building all electric buildings with no greenhouse gas emissions. Luckily, there are also a lot of new funding sources becoming available to incentivize this kind of development. And I'll highlight in the project examples how these projects have been using some of these funds. So in Massachusetts, we have funds, tons of different pots of money from the state. There's also even cities like the Boston Mayor's Office of Housing has some funds available to incentivize affordable housing to do energy efficiency work in both new production and existing buildings, so like deep energy retrofits of existing affordable housing. And we've kind of already touched upon this, but you're going to continue to hear these terms, especially passive house and just high performance design in general. So what is it, right? So passive house is really just a standard where a building is really energy efficient and comfortable and affordable at the same time. So when you have a building that is adhering to the ideals of passive house, it's a really tight building envelope, meaning you are not losing a lot of air and you're not getting a lot of heat or cold air into your building. And you're achieving that through really high performing windows, lots of insulation, good, tight design when it comes to where all of your walls and other things are meeting each other to reduce thermal bridge. And it's also ensuring that you have, because the building is so tight, that you're having adequate ventilation all throughout the building to make sure you're providing that air quality comfort level for residents. And so when we're thinking about building a great building envelope and achieving passive house, it does result in a really comfortable and affordable product in that it's lower utility costs on average because you're able to keep the heat in your unit or keep the cool in your unit, and it's not escaping, not leaking through windows or exterior walls. A lot of you in the audience, right, work in local government in some capacity. And so when I go through the project examples today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on how the opportunity came about and the specific things that the town or city did that were really helpful or supportive to make these projects happen. My hope is, or I think that a lot of you will look at some of these examples and think, wow, my town has a situation just like that. And hopefully you take away some ideas for what you can do in your community for transit-oriented, amenity-oriented projects, and also an appreciation of challenges that can arise when we are doing these sorts of projects. So the project's examples are, these are all, I'm going to talk about all rental apartments today, all just residential, no mixed income. So all rental apartments in places that are really transit and amenity rich. All of these projects are close to jobs, shopping, schools, cultural amenities, healthcare, parks, and I illustrated that by putting up the walk scores up here for these project locations and how close they are to major transit hubs. So these all contribute to things we talked about earlier, like fewer vehicle miles traveled. When you are building these kinds of projects, the inherent point of TOD is to build housing where people can access everything they need, the vast majority of what they need, on foot, by bike, or easily accessing things via transportation steps away from their door. And I think these concepts all contribute to the vibrant communities that we all want to see. All of these projects, with the exception of Hyannis, are currently under construction as we speak today. So the first one in Holyoke, and what I wanted to highlight here was, I'm actually going to skip ahead. This is what this opportunity looked like in Holyoke. Again, you might in your community have a building or a set of buildings right in your downtown core that are blighted or dilapidated, and you walk by every day and think, gosh, if only something could happen here. This is such an amazing location. How do we get someone to be interested in doing something? So, we looked at this, we didn't run away. what I wanted to highlight here is that sometimes things take a lot of time. I've got another example where things don't take a lot of time, but sometimes they do. And sometimes it takes a lot of local leadership to be proactive and take charge of a situation. So here in Holyoke, these buildings illustrate a time when a city eventually took over a property, conveyed it to a redevelopment authority who put a vision together for the property, turned that into an RFP, which generated interest, which got a developer. And 15 years later, it's under construction, going to be opening soon for 88 households, senior, affordable housing, I mean, great things. But the takeaways are sometimes, again, it just can take a while to get these projects going. Patience, other things that the town of Holyoke did for this project was do CPA funding, which we've talked about. And this was a project that by the time it got to an RFP, the local utility company had put a moratorium on natural gas. So it's actually going to be an all-electric mill, which is very exciting. This was also a really, as you can see from here, a really, really big mill. And sometimes these great mill assets that we have in our communities are really big. And there was a thoughtful phasing that was done here. So sometimes you may not be able to do the whole building that you want to all at one time, but you can work on a phasing strategy. This property also, similar to many of our post-industrial mill towns, had a railroad on one side and a canal on the other side, kind of contributing to challenges. But it is under construction today, again, being all electric. So there will be no greenhouse gas emissions from the project. And I just wanted to start with that project before going over to one in Hyannis, which we can talk about later, where this was an opportunity which moved a lot faster than about 15 years. So Hyannis is a community, like many communities with a large tourism sector as a part of their economy, really struggling to find not just seasonal workers, but also year-round workers in their community. And I think we're seeing some of these communities really realize, like right now, when they can't have their hospitals staffed and they can't have their restaurants staffed, that they need to take action now. So there was an existing commercial building that became empty, and the town of Hyannis worked very quickly to rezone this property to make it available for residential development. So, and in that rezoning process, they also thought about parking. I'm going to flip to the amenity map here. So this site in Hyannis is walkable. If you've ever been to downtown Hyannis, it's right on Main Street, kind of a perfect location to access the majority of jobs and amenities in Hyannis within a 15-minute walk. It's also a walk to the Hyannis Transportation Center and to the ferry terminal. And that when the town rezoned and reduced the number of parking spaces that would be needed for this project, that was huge. That really allowed this project to pencil out and be 120 units at the end of the day of affordable mixed income housing. So when municipalities work to lower parking standards, that oftentimes does result in more units being able to be built on the site. And going to skip ahead here. I'm going back to another historic adaptive reuse project. So I wanted to highlight this one because sometimes opportunities come about when there is the funding source available. The Stone Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts is the oldest existing, still standing mill in Lawrence, predates the Civil War. And it had been looked at for a long time by a lot of parties for a lot of uses, including commercial, schools, office, residential. And a pot of money became available from the Department of Energy Resources, DOER, through Massachusetts. And because that pot of money became available, our team was able to get creative and figure out a way to fully put together a financial feasibility for a residential program, which we got the town to support through their 40R Smart Growth District, and again, a zoning lever that the town was able to pull to make this become a residential building. And what that DOER money was going to allow was to make this building not only all electric, not have a single natural gas hookup, but also achieve really high energy efficiency standards. Not quite passive house standards, but almost. And this is really exciting. But sometimes when we're working on these historic projects, there's a lot of challenges when you're working with historic preservation and the historic tax credit program. So oftentimes when developers are working on historic projects, we are utilizing those historic tax credits. And like that's a whole other conversation we can have about how we need to be better incorporating historic preservation standards and energy efficiency goals. But some examples of what we're doing with the DOER money for this project are 4 inches of spray foam insulation throughout the entirety of the building. For context, usually you do 1 to 2 inches of insulation, so this is going to be an incredibly insulated building, which is really helping limit our thermal bridging and get a really good R value performance. But this was a challenge. The historic preservation folks don't like to cover up beautiful brick or stone masonry walls, but to provide comfort and energy efficiency, you have to on the inside. And then for historic preservation, the windows of these historic buildings are often one of the main focal points, right? They're huge, they're large, they're beautiful, and historic preservation, rightly so, wants the end result to look just as nice as the original building. Original single pane wood windows are very hard to replicate. Our goal for this project was to do a casement window, which is one that opens out and comes in, and it can provide a much better seal than a traditional double or single hung window. So we tried to get that approved. We unfortunately were not successful, but that's okay. We just had to go from a double pane window to a triple pane window to kind of achieve some of the same stuff. So we learned a lot from this project in terms of navigating historic preservation and energy efficiency goals. And the last project that I'm going to highlight, I actually realized I should have started with this one as I was thinking about this. In all the projects I just talked about, at the end of the day, the project that is happening, that's under construction right now, is really the project that everyone supported and got on board with and thought was the right project. And in Swampscott, right now we're building 114 units, and we thought it should be more. And this was actually a case where, as we were going through zoning, this was a 40B project, utilizing a bunch of really underutilized land, mostly an empty parking lot right near, like a block away from the MBTA commuter rail station. We wanted 128 units and fewer parking spaces than the town and local residents wanted. So we ended up having to provide more parking than we truly thought was necessary to successfully lease the property, and that had to result in also a reduction of units. So we're super thankful that this project eventually got passed and is being built, but when there's only one bite at the apple, you kind of really want to make sure you're getting as many units in as you possibly can, and this was a case that didn't happen, and I'm going to blame parking for this one. So I will stop there and happy to answer more questions about these projects or any others during the Q&A.
All right, great. Great. Well, thank you. So we have time for questions and conversation if folks in the audience have any questions. One thing I just wanted to start with is just a acknowledgement of the great work that Wynn is doing around existing buildings and historic buildings, because many of those buildings actually are not required to meet the energy code. And so you technically could do very little as it relates to energy efficiency and performance and still be meeting requirements. But I think this is a great example of a team who has committed to this and has really pushed project teams, even when there are historic tax credits, to be able to achieve those performance requirements. The other wonderful thing about utilizing existing buildings is that they are a huge benefit in terms of embodied carbon. So there's operational carbon, which is the energy that buildings use and the emissions associated with them when they're in their operational phase. But energy is consumed when we make building materials and when we transport building materials. And so utilizing existing structures in communities that are close to amenities and transit has so many benefits from that perspective on an emissions side as well. So just an acknowledgement that not every team is doing that type of work, but also something to think about if you have a historic building in your community that you would like to redevelop into a high-performance asset, that you may not be able to depend on the energy code for those. And so there's going to have to be other levers that you're pulling to make sure that you do get a high-performance building there. So with that, I'd love to open it up for questions. Yes, I think we've got a microphone coming around.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. So I think my community, a lot of people in my community get this, the sustainability, denser housing by the train. But we now have a really vocal group that is focusing on the wetlands and the trees. And they're saying that the Wetlands Protection Act isn't good enough, so we can't even develop on disturbed land in the buffer zone. If we take down one tree, we're destroying the planet. This isn't my area of expertise. I'm a housing advocate. So I'm looking for, I have to trust them that they're speaking honestly. And we had one project where it was going to be an all-electric, highly efficient multifamily housing, walk to the train and shops. And these people came out and they fought it, and now it's going to be 6 to 7 single-family homes with, whatever energy efficiency our building code is, which we do have the specialized code in our town. But I'm just wondering, do you have any resources or any thoughts on, because I do want to save the planet, what is this new focus on the wetlands and the trees and not thinking about what you all have been talking about, which I think is really important as well.
Julie, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can take a stab. I can't say that I know the intentions of these individuals, but I will say that sounds like NIMBYism in disguise that we often see in communities. We've seen it with many of our planning projects too, that people who may just not want housing in their communities will point to trees or other benefits and use that as an excuse and a reason to argue for no housing. So I'd put that up front as a potential intention that they may have in that. But there also are some people who are very well-intentioned and are very concerned about trees, and trees are important. So there's, I think, a few policy levers you could think about in your community. There can be a policy you can put in place of no net loss of trees, for example. So if a project requires you to take down a tree, plant several in another location, so there's no net loss of trees, or seeing if there's a way to work with the developer to work around the trees. I think there was just an example in Jamaica Plain of a really big tree that was in the way of a housing development, and the developer worked with the community to keep the tree and move the housing forward. So figuring out ways to do both and. From the wetlands side, I think you would want to defer to the wetlands regulations, but if people are trying to push those further, again, I'd question their intentions and kind of ask where that's coming from. And then encourage you in your planning processes too, housing production plans, climate action plans, put this stuff in writing about what your priorities are and where you'll do things, because you can use that as an argument against those voices that will come out in those processes as well. We have a tool we're trying to finish. MAPC has a greenhouse gas inventory tool that applies to every municipality in Massachusetts, so you're welcome to use it to understand how many greenhouse gas emissions your municipality generates community-wide. And we're trying to add a module to it for natural lands so that you can measure the benefit of trees and preserved spaces and how much carbon that saves you. But the spoiler alert is one tree is not making a difference. It probably provides lots of beautiful value and other intrinsic value, but from a carbon standpoint, it's not a very valid argument, especially if you plant more trees in another location. So those are my initial thoughts.
Carol, you had something? wanted to say? Or
First of all, thank you all. It's a great presentation. I have two questions. Thank you all. It's really a great presentation. As we electrify, how will the grid keep up? I mean, if we are able to move in that direction, what is happening with the grid to make sure that we can move in the direction that you're suggesting? That is one question. The other has to do with rates. And as we move towards electrification and off of fossil fuels, how do we ensure that those left paying the fossil fuel bill for energy, which are often folks who can less afford the electrification, don't get saddled with a greater bill because of the rates? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with the rate question because that's something that's being really actively considered right now, and there's strong advocacy happening around making sure that electrification doesn't create additional energy burden on low-income individuals and households. So the DPU is actually currently evaluating electric rates and the opportunity that may exist to create like a clean electric rate, essentially, which would mean that if you are fuel switching from something like natural gas to electricity, you potentially have a lower electric rate, which would mitigate the sort of delta in costs that we do see between natural gas and electricity. So for folks who are working on sort of existing building projects where you are looking at converting from fossil fuels to electricity, it is more expensive per unit of energy for electricity than it is for something like natural gas. But if you have other buildings that are right now inefficient electric or on other types of delivered fuels, oftentimes the economics are in your favor. So I think the challenge is really the sort of conversion from natural gas to clean electricity, and they are actively debating at the DPU now creation of electric rates that would facilitate that and really reduce the impact, because if you look across the country, we have very different electric rates in different parts of the country, and so here in Massachusetts we struggle because our electric rates are high. Jill, you want to talk
maybe
about
I'd add to that with that DPU case, our organization and others commented really strongly on a tiered pricing structure that we'd like to see researched and hopefully implemented, so that the RR2 rate or the subsidized electricity rate, in addition to applying to those who use clean heating and cooling, would be tiered based on income and hopefully avoid any dangerous drop-offs for residents. If they cross a certain threshold, they'd lose the rate. So we advocated for that rate to apply to up to 80% of area median income. On the grid capacity side, there is a lot of work around that happening at the state level. So the recent climate bill created a grid modernization advisory council that one of my colleagues has been a part of. So that required for the first time investor-owned utilities to create grid modernization plans, where they basically map out and with stakeholder input from a diverse constituency, basically say this is how we're going to modernize the grid and get it ready for the future electrification that we need to have of everything, essentially, to meet our climate goals. And then there also is a siting commission that met in Massachusetts to think about clean energy siting and what rules and regulations do we need to shift around that to make it easier to build good clean energy infrastructure in the Commonwealth. And there's legislation that we expect we hope will move ahead and pass this session to help make that piece of the puzzle easier as well.
But I think it is true that we do have these sort of simultaneous issues that we have to work on in parallel. And so you know, Angela, you can probably comment on the fact that there are challenging projects where there are some capacity issues that have to be navigated in real time.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one thing that I've seen on projects is, and this was brought up on, I can't remember which building code, but making them simply all electric ready, not necessarily plugging all electric into the system right now, but when you're doing a new construction project, setting it up for success so that when maybe there's some of the stuff is figured out, it can just easily get switched over to do that. And I think that's really smart to do. So you might still have that natural gas heating your water in that building, but maybe that's only going to be for a few years.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, sorry. I'll make sure.
Are any of these new developments, do they have solar? Have you put solar on them? And if not, how come?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the solar is, I'll start with the historic buildings. Typically with historic adaptive reuse projects that are utilizing federal and or state historic tax credits, unfortunately solar does not play nicely because a part of the exterior historic preservation is preserving the roof and showing the roof and having that be a big part of the building. However, I can say at both those historic projects, we are doing EV charging stations, so that's great. We're allowed to do that. But going back to solar, I believe it is a passive house requirement if you are going to that certification to at least do a solar-ready roof. So because of the way that the solar program works when you actually plug into the grid and whatnot, our company typically does it actually after the building's constructed, and we take care of it ourselves, so it's not a part of our construction of the new building. But so what we do in construction is just make them solar ready, and then we go on and add the panels later.
I would just add that there's going to be significant resources starting to flow into Massachusetts through the Solar for All program. And so Department of Energy Resources is going to be administering the program to provide resources very specifically targeted also at affordable housing to help support implementation of solar. So we're going to start to see even more access to resources around solar than we have before.
Hi. This is just a little plug for wetlands. I'm the conservation agent for my town, as well as staffing the Affordable Housing Trust. So I am a big proponent of affordable housing, but I'm also a big proponent of wetlands. And I don't know this specific case; it could be a NIMBY situation, but with climate change, especially, wetlands are incredibly important. And all the flood water we're getting, they absorb that flood water, they filter pollutants. And as towns get more and more developed, people are getting closer and closer to the wetlands, and that damages the wetlands, and that causes a lot of other problems. So when you're combating climate change, and you do need to think about energy efficiency and sustainability, but also the other things in the environment, and the tree, like where the tree is can also impact that. If the tree is right near the wetland and you cut the tree, that's going to hurt the wetland because now the sun's going to come in and start drying out the wetland. So again, I don't know this specific case, and it could certainly be NIMBY, but the wetlands are also really important. So I just had to put a little plug in. Thanks.
And maybe I could say I didn't mean to say wetlands are not important. I fully agree. I think I heard her say it was in like an area that wasn't classified but was next to it. And again, we don't know the case, but hopefully regulations are being updated as well to account for climate change, because that's important also if the areas are shifting.
And I do just want to add a plug. I know the team at MHP is part of the Unlocking Housing Production Commission, and they are specifically looking at some of these issues and sort of how to make sure that you're navigating them appropriately and giving priority to both issues, but not ending up in a place where certain things can be used to combat, housing just purely for that purpose. We've got a question right down here.
Thank you. So I'm here with an economic development organization, and we represent a lot of developers as well as municipalities. And what I have heard, I was glad, Julie, that you brought up the premium of what it costs to incorporate these, because we hear from our developers, we have a real estate summit every year, and just last fall they were telling us that 2 to 3% is not sufficient to budget in, that they find on average about 8% premium on these projects. So are there resources that I can direct them to, since you said that you've been talking to developers a lot recently, resources where I can help them figure out how to bring that down to the 2 to 3% range rather than having it be an 8% premium?
A few thoughts. The Passive House Institute has resources on the cost premium on their website of building to passive house, so I defer there first into their expertise. The numbers I was citing, the 2 to 10% range, came from qualitative interviews with developers from 2022. So I can hold that up, but it's not published somewhere or peer-reviewed research in that sense. And the other organization that's done some studies on this is the Department of Energy Resources. They did economic analyses that they commissioned from a third party to look at what the cost premium or lack thereof of the stretch and specialized code would be across different housing typologies. And those studies are available on their website and actually show, I believe that in every case or nearly every case, there's cost savings associated with building to the stretch or specialized code once you stack the different state and federal incentives on top that make it pencil out. And then I've also heard, and this is beyond my area of expertise, so I defer to Angela and Lauren, but that mass housing will underwrite and help you factor in some of the operational savings of a building if you're going to own and operate the building after, and count that into your value stack. So it's not just the upfront cost, but how much you're saving over time. And once you can factor that in, that makes highly efficient housing look much more competitive.
Yeah, Angela, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit to just sort of relative impact of all of the sort of things you consider around cost. So as you're developing, these passive house projects that have a lot of other sort of requirements associated with them, what are the things that are actually driving costs most significantly?
Sure. So I'll start with that and then get to the cost premium. So, every project is different, but generally when we're talking about transit and amenity-oriented developments, that is expensive land. So there's typically just an expensive land cost for these projects. I would also say, generally speaking, these projects are in areas that might be in complicated utility areas with just lots of utilities that have been done in the town over many years, next to waterways, next to rail lines, and all of those things add complexity and cost. So for projects near railroads, you need to figure out easements with the railroad companies, pay them to shut down during certain times so you can do your work. And that's a whole thing. For properties properties in flood zones, which is another very common thing that we run into, you have to do enough work so that you actually raise the entirety of the first floor of the building to be above the floodplain. And sometimes that can be moving a building up more than a foot. So that adds a significant cost. So there are a lot of things that contribute overall, I think, to these projects that we want to be in this location to be a little more expensive than say, a greenfield development somewhere. And so that I think can be maybe better understood globally, that these projects are complex and they're expensive, but we are very lucky here in Massachusetts to have a lot of money available to support that work, and kind of how we think about it, these extraordinary costs. Specifically on the cost premium for doing passive house or similar certifications, I've seen it is more expensive. I've seen a range. On the one hand, I'm optimistic that we're seeing more and more manufacturers and suppliers build things to what we need them to build them to. I can think of today, there are way more window manufacturers making the right kinds of windows for passive house than there was like 5 years ago. So I do think the market is going to start to see more competition. That will hopefully bring down prices. The past few years have still been really rocky from COVID and supply chain issues, and I really just think we're still kind of seeing that settle down. So I think in a few years, especially since so many projects are under construction right now, I think we'll be able in a few years, I don't know, maybe MHP or MAPC can do a great look back on these costs. But I would say in general, there is still a premium, and it really depends. But overall, these projects are also just expensive because of their complex locations.
Yeah, I think I would add to that we are seeing a reduction in sort of fear factor pricing on the part of contractors. So once a contractor has worked on a passive house project before and sort of been through it, it demystifies it a little bit, and they start to understand that it's a sort of better quality product, but not alien to what they typically do and what they can get their subs to do. And so I do think we'll continue to see cost compression that will come from sort of just a familiarity on the part of the contractors and the subcontractors with this type of construction and level of performance. Yes, we've got one over here.
Hi, this is a question probably for Angela, but wondering when you're looking at a rebuild site or a new build site, I'm sure it's site specific, but do you have like sort of a guideline of it just doesn't make sense unless we can build X number of units, and the thought process around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say whatever an opportunity might be, from a developer's perspective, we are running numbers like really early on and kind of doing a really rough penciling out of what are kind of the minimum number of units that would need to get built to not only construct the project, but then keep it afloat operationally once it's built. That's actually a really big part of it too, especially a company like Wynn is a long-term property manager, so we care a lot about being able to own and manage that property for the next 50 years. So typically, generally speaking, for a number of reasons, a sweet spot, I think, tends to be on the larger side for a lot of municipalities. A lot of it has to do, if you just think about it, it's kind of intuitive, like staffing, the staffing needs of a multifamily property. Typically, like 100 units is a sweet spot for one property manager, one maintenance supervisor, one technician. You're going to pay all those salaries whether you have 40 units or 100 units, right? So part of the penciling out is thinking about those kind of fixed costs and stuff like that, as well as the rents and just all of the funds available. I will stop there. Do you guys have anything to add?
Hi, we are a nonprofit affordable housing developer in the West Metro region, and we're really proud to be building highly sustainable, passive house certified, affordable communities in the region. One of the challenges that we're seeing is the availability of electrical infrastructure equipment, transformers, switchgears, media sockets, you name it. So while that's absolutely not a reason not to pursue electrification, I'm just curious if there are efforts underway to address the supply chain issues that we're seeing.
I have lived these supply chain issues. Yeah, no, that's a great question and a very relevant question for, I think, truly every project under construction right now, I think in the entire US. And my understanding is actually, it goes back to climate change, and a part of the supply chain issue for electrical equipment that utility companies need to get their things into the building, so transformers, meters, meter sockets. When we have hurricanes, tornadoes, those catastrophic weather events taking place in our country, a lot of times that same infrastructure is getting ruined. And that is a very high priority. It's for these companies to go and for manufacturers to allocate all of their resources to fixing those problems in those locations due to these weather events. So it's kind of an interesting connection there. So yes, we are still to this day seeing significant delays in what is critical infrastructure. You cannot operate and open your property without these pieces of equipment. I wish I had a better answer for what conversations might be happening. I do think we have tried to elevate things up to the federal level, see what can go on. I know there's, I could get in the weeds, but I know there's, this company bought this company and there's supply chain issues from that. But I do think we're going to continue to see this be a problem for the next few years, is what I would predict.
Any other final questions?
Thank you. Sorry to make you run. We've encountered two arguments from people who genuinely are concerned about ecological sustainability, but ultimately turn into kind of anti-housing arguments. And one is for communities that don't have, aren't as amenity rich and don't have, let's say, rail stations. They say, well, housing should be built over there, not here, where we don't have any of that, and it would be less sustainable. And two, there is a conception that single-family housing may be more sustainable, less ecologically impactful on climate than multifamily, and therefore multifamily should not be built in their community. Do you have any responses to either of those arguments?
Yeah, we may all have something to jump in on here. In the slides that I shared that I think are in your packet, the map that was from the New York Times is actually from a study that a university had done about the carbon emissions associated with density and denser housing. So you could look at that and actually find your community and see. But basically, it makes the argument that more density and multifamily housing does lead to a lower carbon footprint. People might be pointing towards other aspects of single-family housing and large yards that they enjoy and some of the nature-based benefits of that when they make that argument. But if you're trying to look at it from a carbon-based perspective, density definitely is more sustainable and leads to lower emissions. To the argument that my community is not amenity-rich and doesn't have transit and therefore shouldn't have housing, it's like a more advanced NIMBY argument than I've heard recently. I think when I talk to communities about it, I point out that a carbon emission is a carbon emission. So whether the emission is generated in your community or another community, it still contributes to climate change, and we all have an obligation as municipalities to build housing and provide people with places to live, and we should control how we do that. We should adopt the stretch code or the specialized code and make that housing as sustainable as possible, and in doing so, we will help solve the climate crisis. If you don't do that in your municipality, maybe that housing will get built elsewhere in a community that doesn't care about climate change, and it won't be built to such a highly efficient standard, and you won't be helping to solve the problem in that way. So I've tried that argument out. It's one you could try working with. I guess I need to add anything.
No, God, no. I'm good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Angela and Julie. Really appreciate you being here. And we will close on that note. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. This is one of those topics that we don't have a choice but to be talking about housing and climate together, so I really appreciate it. We are about to be transitioning to lunch, which I think is going to be out any minute. So just a heads up, next up will be our Housing Heroes Award. So once the food does come out, we're asking folks to get through the line as quickly as possible so we can get right to celebrating our housing heroes. All right, thanks so much.
I'm Clark Ziegler. I'm the Executive Director of MHP, and it is my pleasure to introduce Ed Augustus, the Secretary of Housing and Livable Communities, who many of you know. I'm sure if we had time for a show of hands, you've probably seen him in almost every one of your communities at one time or another. He's been in the job for about almost exactly a year, and for those who don't know the Secretary, he came to the job with a really wide array of experience at the federal, state, and local level. He was Chief of Staff to Congressman Jim McGovern, State Senator in Massachusetts, and City Manager in Worcester, so he brings a whole depth of experience to this position, which we really badly need. Two things I want to say about the Secretary. One is he has been an incredibly strong supporter of MHP and its work, and we really appreciate that. The second thing I would say is within state government, there has been more robust discussion about bold solutions to the housing crisis over the last 12 months during his time as Secretary, more than we had during the previous 10 years combined. Really, this is a leader and a Secretary who is really leading the charge here to tackle our housing crisis, and it's been a pleasure having the opportunity to work with him. So he will be making a few remarks and then presenting this year's Housing Hero Awards. So Secretary Augustus.
Thank you, Clark, for those generous words. And right back at you. I've enjoyed working with Clark and his whole team and all the folks at MHP, and they are with us everywhere we go. We just wrapped up 14 listening sessions around the state, and I think Callie is here somewhere. She's got a free coffee because she got her ticket stamped at all 14 of those listening sessions. So very well done. We appreciate that partnership. And I have to just do a Worcester brag moment because I was city manager here in Worcester for 9 years, and I was born and raised here in Worcester. And this location that you're in right now, some of you who maybe are a little older might remember the Worcester Galleria, which was a mall that was built in 1970. Like a lot of cities, it kind of tore down a bunch of blocks in the core of our city, built this mall. And it was successful for some number of years, and then like a lot of malls, it started kind of atrophying over time, and then the decision was made to tear down the mall and reconfigure the blocks to what it had been before, never restoring some of the beautiful buildings that were there, but trying to create smaller developmental parcels, including the one we're on now. So we're like literally in the spot where the mall was. So we're probably standing right where I sat on Santa Claus's lap in 1972, telling him exactly what I wanted for Christmas. I still didn't get it, but hope springs eternal. Again, thank you for the 39 years. Think about this, 39 years of service that Mass Housing Partnership has provided to not only the Commonwealth, but more importantly to the cities and towns, the advocates, the housing heroes, some of which we'll celebrate today, who are out in the trenches, who are doing the work day in and day out. And they provide so much great technical assistance to all of you so that you're armed with the ammunition and the facts that you need to help us build the housing that we all need. So again, thank you to them for that. I also, as Clark mentioned, you may or may not know, 30 years ago, at the end of the Dukakis administration, was the last time there was a housing secretary in Massachusetts. Prior to that, or after that, when Governor Weld came in, he took the Economic Development Secretariat and the Housing Secretariat and put them together. And that's the way they existed for the next 30 years under Democratic and Republican administrations. And Governor Healy, when she was campaigning, it was clear every audience that she went before, whether it was hospital CEOs, whether it was business leaders, whether it was community-based organizations, whether it was tenant groups, everybody said the same thing. Housing is the most pressing challenge that we face. And so she committed to creating a standalone secretariat so there'd be somebody focused on housing, particularly with an eye on preserving what we have for affordable housing here in Massachusetts and trying to create more to meet the need. And you know, I'm very excited about the prospects that we have of getting the Affordable Homes Act, which is the largest housing bill in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, onto the governor's desk so she can sign that piece of legislation and we can get those billions of dollars out into your hands and other communities and developers' hands to build more units, preserve more units. I was up in Winchton first thing this morning, visiting the Housing Authority in Winchton. Massachusetts is blessed to have 43,000 units of state-owned public housing. We're the only state to have such a robust portfolio of state-owned public housing. There are about 70,000 people that live in those 43,000 units in 231 cities and towns across the state. Stop for 1 minute and think to yourself, where would they be? Where would we be if we didn't have those units of housing online? In this market, you put 70,000 more people out looking for an affordable place to live, many of them disabled or senior citizens. Thank God we have that, and it's our obligation, our moral obligation, to make sure we keep that online and that we make sure it's healthy and safe and dignified, just the way everybody deserves to live. And we're committed to that in this bill and so many other things. So just a commercial for the Affordable Homes Act. Thanks to the House of Representatives for passing it overwhelmingly. 145 to 13. Very strong support in the House of Representatives. So the Senate is next up to bat to take the bill up, hopefully in the coming weeks. And I would just urge you, if you care about ADUs as of right, if you care about pumping more money into public housing and more money into housing production, if you care about creating supportive housing, if you care about Housing Works programs to help support infrastructure that often is a gating issue to the creation of more units of housing, then support the Affordable Homes Act, get the Senate to support that, and let's get this job done. So thank you for that. Thanks for the opportunity to do that. Quick plug for the Affordable Homes Act. And now on to really what we're all here to do is to support some housing heroes. And the first person that's being honored today, Greg Reben. Greg is somebody I had the chance last Friday to speak to the Charles River Chamber of Commerce. I was on a call with him yesterday. I'm going to be on a call with him first thing tomorrow morning, talking to business leaders. So he's got as crazy a schedule as I do, but he is all in. Even though he runs a Chamber of Commerce, he is so focused and so dedicated on housing and understands that the relationship between healthy businesses, thriving businesses, businesses that are able to expand, and when they expand, they pay more taxes. I put my city manager hat back on, to those local communities. They create jobs. People who have jobs have the ability to pay for housing and spend money in the community and create that virtuous cycle that every community is looking for, and Greg gets it. But I really want to just recognize Greg as the housing hero because he realizes the symbiotic relationship between housing advocates, environmentalists, and business leaders. They need each other, and Greg knows this. If you're not on his email list, you should be. A former journalist, Greg has an exceptional way of explaining why housing is important, especially to the business community. A community organizer at heart, he has utilized his background in digital, print, and broadcast media to help tell the story of why it's important to allow room for growth in the state's MBTA communities. And the messenger matters. Greg works with local business owners to understand how powerful their voices are, and how we really need their voices in this debate. And thanks to Greg's leadership, all of the Charles River Chamber communities are having better informed conversations and working to comply with the MBTA Communities Law. For these reasons and many more, we're honoring Greg Reben as one of the housing heroes. Awesome. Congratulations. We'll probably do a photo there. Yeah, we'll do a quick photo. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you so much for that, and to everyone. This is really sweet. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate what the administration is doing and the fact that you've made this a priority. And it doesn't matter which member of the administration comes to speak to us, they all recognize, whether it's Transportation Secretary or whatever, that housing is key here. And I'm proud to stand with Meredith and Abundant Housing and the town of Brewster today with this honor. But really, my thanks is to all of you who've been engaged in this fight for a really long time, many for decades. You've been advocating for housing for our workforce without enough help from the business community, frankly, until very recently. My chamber entered the fight on this housing just before the pandemic. A few years before that, we had suffered a bunch of losses, the same kind of losses that you're all familiar with in every one of our kind of communities that are all too common. And it wasn't until we stood with housing advocates, the environmentalists, and clergy that we really were able to build a coalition to really move the needle on moving housing projects forward, getting them approved in Newton, and then moving on to do that in our other communities as well. So it's really takes a team effort. One of us can't do it alone, but businesses need to be at the table, and that's got to be our path forward. The Secretary mentioned tomorrow we're going to talk to chambers from across the state in a program really to engage them. A lot of times small chambers, and I'm guessing a lot of the small business associations in your communities don't know how to talk about this or maybe a little bit afraid. So it's really about us giving them the courage to do that. It's about all of you giving them encouragement to do that. It's about getting the actual business owners to stand up and say, this matters to my hospital, to my daycare business, to my coffee shop, to have this housing. So we're going to really work with chambers regionally with, thanks to CHAPA and thanks to MHP and Eastern Bank, on a program that is designed to roll this out to other chambers. And I feel optimistic about it. I know how hard it is. But I want to end by thanking my housing heroes. And those are the housing advocates who've been in the trenches in our communities for this fight. In many cases, again, longer than the businesses have. So Engine 6, Newton for Everyone in Newton, the Needham Housing Coalition, Building a Better Wellesley, and Housing for All in Watertown. Those are the folks that we stand with every day and try to get this fight together, and that's the only way it's going to work. So thanks to all of you. Thanks again.
The next recipient is the town of Brewster. The town of Brewster is a housing hero for its long-standing dedicated efforts to increase the supply of affordable housing in the town as well as the Lower Cape community. The town staff have been working tirelessly to create safe and affordable homes for everyone. They've used numerous tools to make that happen, and they have an effective affordable housing trust, a current housing production plan. They've leveraged Community Preservation Act funds and have a local housing partnership, checking all the boxes. In addition, the town has received $1.6 million in MassWorks grant to support road and sidewalk improvements, as well as the installation of an innovative alternative septic system for the Brewster Woods development. We are pleased to announce this morning that the town of Brewster has been designated as a housing choice community. The Housing Choice Initiative recognizes and supports communities that have taken action to address our housing challenges head-on. In a 5-year period, the small town of Brewster, less than 10,000 population, created 208 new units of housing. What an achievement. Congratulations to the town of Brewster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and to MHP for this honor. My name is Ned Chatelaine. I'm the chair of the Brewster Select Board and joined by representatives from across the housing spectrum on the stage here. It is unfortunately a cliche, or maybe it is a cliche because it is true, that housing is a community-wide effort. It is not just a team effort, but a community-wide effort. And in Brewster, we're fortunate to have residents who have supported the creation of the Affordable Housing Trust in the last few years, who have generously funded it with revenues from the short-term rental tax, and with a Community Preservation Act funding. We're fortunate to have a Community Preservation Act committee who is dedicated to housing and understands its importance and has been generous not only in Brewster but in regional housing initiatives with their funding grants. We're fortunate to have a housing partnership that is tireless in their work in advocating and educating our community about the housing issues that are confronting Brewster and the Cape and the state and, of course, the country as a whole. And we are incredibly fortunate to have some of the best staff in the housing space in the state of Massachusetts. This is true. I'd like to especially recognize some faces I'm sure many of you know in the audience. Jill Scalise, Brewster's Housing Coordinator. And Donna Kalanick, Brewster's Assistant Town Manager. It is no exaggeration to say that the progress Brewster has made towards achieving our housing goals would not have been possible in the last few years without the hard work of Donna and Jill. So thank you all very much for this honor on behalf of Brewster, and have a good afternoon.
The next honoree is Braintree Councilor Meredith Bodrick. Did you know that up through the 1980s, Massachusetts was building around 30,000 new homes a year? Since then, production has been cut by nearly half. But the demand has not been cut at all. And matter of fact, it's increased. When something is in short supply and high demand, prices rise. Braintree Town Council member Meredith Bodrick is someone who has done the math. We recognize her as a housing hero for her advocacy for new development that will increase housing options in the town. The age-old economic principle of supply and demand has landed us where we are today. Increasing our housing supply will put us back on track. So the councilor used actual data to show the concerning trend that the town's housing production had been slowing in recent years. And she used the data to highlight examples of multifamily properties currently in Braintree that are already more than 15 units per acre. Councilor Bodrick has worked to increase community engagement with municipal officials and staff, including hosting community meetings to facilitate conversations between residents and potential developers. And she has been an outspoken in her support of the MBTA Communities Law. Thank you. And has worked hard to highlight the positive economic impact of having multifamily housing in her community. Congratulations, Councilor Bodrick.
Thank you so much, Secretary. I am honored to receive this recognition. Housing advocacy has been a passion of mine for decades, and the issue that inspired me to run for office after a 40R proposal blew up in Braintree in 2018. As an elected official, I often say that governing is a group effort, and so too is this recognition. Achieving my goal to pass the MBTA Communities Act with support in Braintree would not have been possible without Lily Link of CHAPA, Joyce Mandel of Abundant Housing MA, MHP's many useful resources, Braintree's Planning Director, Melissa Santucci-Razzi, and of course my family, who allow me to give so much of my time to my community. Braintree, like communities across the Commonwealth, needs safe, affordable, and available housing. No one in this room needs convincing of that. However, most of the people in our communities aren't in this room today. So if we want to tackle big systemic problems like housing affordability and the connected issues of equity and the environment, our challenge and our opportunity is showing residents that big issues are not abstractions, but rather problems that are both personal and solvable. And we do this by making the connection between our value-driven policies and individual concerns. I believe in this approach because I experienced it firsthand. On my first day in my new job as a parent, I was handed an assignment different than the one I expected. My son was born with a tethered spinal cord, a permanent paralyzing disability. And certainly our 1908 house was not up to ADA standards. As a one-salary family at the time, we did not know how we would afford the major renovation required to maintain his independence in our home. Thankfully, public policy stepped in. The state's generous home modification loan program allowed us to renovate and remain in our home. My story is one of many when public policy did exactly what we all hope for: make people's lives a little bit easier by solving personal problems. As policymakers and advocates, when we can help people connect the dots between their individual concerns and the wider common good, abstract goals become a picture full of potential and a way for our ideals to solve everyday problems. And we do it best when we do it together. And I am just so honored and delighted to share this recognition with all of you. So thank you so much.
This next group that we're honoring, Abundant Housing Staff, this is a group of folks who I just thank every day are on our side on this issue. I spoke at a rally they did with the Lieutenant Governor in front of the State House a couple of weeks ago, and they had an army of folks there ready to kind of hit the doors in the State House and work with our legislators. And again, it's great to have a backup team like you all helping us get this done. Abundant Housing is on the front lines of the housing cause, demanding that our elected officials make Massachusetts a place where everyone can afford to live in a safe and comfortable home. Abundant Housing has been a leading force for better housing, better policies, better quality of life for us all. You speak for those who don't have a voice, and for those whose voices have been all but silenced. You have been instrumental in supporting the Affordable Homes Act. In particular, you've been an avid supporter of the push for allowing accessory dwelling units by right, an important provision in the Affordable Homes Act. It has the support it has today, and it passed in the House of Representatives without being watered down, in no small part because of the efforts of Abundant Housing. Since their founding in 2020, Abundant Housing has helped build a strong and active support for the work of housing advocacy groups across the Commonwealth, some of whom are in this room today. The Abundant Housing staff are housing heroes. Accepting on behalf of the organization is Casey Infante, but maybe the whole team wants to come up and do a picture at the same time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary and MHP. I'm so excited to be here. It's hard to talk because my smile has not left my face. My name is Cassie Infante, for those that may not know me. I'm so honored to accept this award on behalf of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. I help lead operations and organizing there. It's hard to believe, but less than 3 years ago, AMA, Abundant Housing Mass for short, was just a dream spun at the kitchen table of founding board members Molly Goodman, Bayasmin Jimenez, Jesse Kansen-Beninoff, and others. 2 years ago, we were a staff of 2, me and Jesse. We spent a lot of our time writing newsletters. But today, we're a small but mighty team of 7, supporting dozens of pro-housing local groups and members across the state. Today, we are housing heroes. For those that may not know us, our vision is to build a Massachusetts for everyone by increasing the housing supply across income levels. We do this through grassroots level community engagement and statewide lobbying. Our small but mighty team is a testament. You can start seemingly small and still have a really big impact. We build this movement by connecting advocates to each other in order to build long-term momentum and solidarity across the state, connecting advocates, not only for the challenges of today, but the promises of tomorrow. I want to take a moment and sincerely honor and recognize the people who brought this moment of recognition to fruition, our incredible organizing team, Joyce Mandel, Elvira Mora, Julia Davidovitz. We also have Cheryl Daniel in communications and Mike Kreisberg in policy. If you could please stand and we could welcome them with a round of applause. Thank you so much. Finally, I want to thank our fearless leader, Jesse Kanson-Beninoff, who couldn't be here. He's sick. Please send him warm wishes. Of course, thank you so much to MHP. Our work is made stronger by the path that you have paved, and we're so grateful to be in community with you today. Thank you.
So before I head out, I did want to just acknowledge one more issue that we're all tackling together. And first, thank you for all your efforts to date with passage of the MBTA community zoning changes community by community. 177 times we're going to go through this process of going to planning boards and town meetings and city councils and getting this process of removing some of the historic local barriers that have existed to multifamily dense housing near our transit nodes. This is the issue of our time. It really, really is. We are not going to meet all of our climate goals as a state. We're not going to be able to stay competitive as a state. We're not going to be able to stay affordable as a state if we don't get this done. And I know a few communities that are kind of balking at this get a lot of the attention, but I do want to lift up and acknowledge that most of the communities, the vast majority of the communities, are having tough conversations, vigorous debates, heartfelt debates, but they're doing what the founders always anticipated that we would be able to do: reason together. Have a common problem, not vilify each other, but try to understand and then figure out ways to make it work, how to comply with the law. And so far, of all the proposals that have been brought to their town meeting or to their city council, 85% have passed. That's a pretty good batting average. So don't lose hope. Don't give up. This is tough work. If it wasn't tough work, it'd already be done. This is the challenge of our time, and thank you all for stepping up and meeting that challenge. I want to thank again MHP, who've been one of our providers of technical assistance. We've put about $7 million of technical assistance and grants into these 177 communities to help them. We don't want to just come in with a stick and tell them what to do. We're just saying you need to create these zones, but you decide where to create them in your community. You decide how to put the plan together. Again, that's a partnership, and providing the resources and the support and the technical assistance to help them get there, I think that is, what we want to see as a partnership, not a top-down, but a together. And finally, I'm on my way to meet the governor in Arlington, where we're going to announce some capital improvement plan for the upcoming year, and we'll have a new program in there. So I don't want to say too much, but stay tuned because we're looking to put new tools in the toolbox so that we continue to partner with you all out in these communities as you're doing the hard work. Thank you, and congratulations to all the winners.
All right. Thank you so much, Secretary. It's really still wonderful to say Secretary of Housing and Livable Communities. It's changed the conversation we're all having. And congratulations to all the housing heroes. So we've got a little break, and at 1 o'clock we're starting back up with our two sessions, one in here and one in the tent. And then the second breakout after that, and then we'll all be coming back together. So we'll see you all soon.